Council Chair, we are now live.
Good afternoon. This hearing is called to order, and I understand that state law currently requires that the following announcement be made at the beginning of every remote public hearing as follows. Due to the current public health emergency, City Council committees are currently meeting remotely. We're using Microsoft Teams to make these remote hearings possible. Instructions for how the public may view and offer public testimony at public hearings of council committees are included in the public hearing notices that are published in the Daily News, Inquirer, and Legal Intelligencer prior to the hearings, and can also be found on phlcouncil.com.
Is that what he said, or not?
So this hearing is called to order. I recognize the presence of a quorum of committee members. Members of the committee in attendance are Majority Leader Sherelle Parker, Majority Whip Curtis Jones Jr., Vice Chairman Brian O'Neill of this committee, Council Members Gilmore Richardson, Council Member Green, Council Member Brooks, Council Member Thomas, and Council Member Quinones Sanchez. We introduced this resolution with co-sponsors, Council Member, let me back up. This is a public hearing of the Committee on Fiscal Responsibility and Intergovernmental Cooperation. The purpose of this public hearing is to hear testimony on Resolution 200406. I introduced this resolution. Councilmember Quinones Sanchez, Councilmember Zuella, Councilmember Gilmore Richardson, Councilmember Bass, and Councilmember Thomas. The clerk will now please read the title of the resolution before this committee today.
Authorizing the Committee on Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation to hold quarterly hearings that include monthly reporting requirements to discuss the fiscal position and overarching social impact goals of the city, including and as related to the 5-year plan and the reporting requirements set forth in the quarterly city manager's report as submitted to the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority.
So before we begin, I want to briefly mention why we're meeting here today. We're all living in some unprecedented times with people worried about jobs, housing, and actually putting food on the table. But now more than ever, it's important that we're all working together as a team in government to make sure we can help people to the fullest extent possible and do what's needed to be confident in our city's finances and ability to weather this storm. We need to come together as a team. Remember, together, everyone achieves more. Just a month ago, we voted on the city's budget. And I said this committee was going to work to address and better account for the administration's spending, efficiency efforts, management practices, and strategic investments, as well as set some goals that we in council should expect for our short-term health and our long-term well-being. We called this hearing so we can start the process and conversations we need to have. Today we'll be talking about the city's recently approved 5-year plan, expectations for this fiscal year and beyond. We'll hear from the Pew Foundation how others are faring relative to Philadelphia, other cities. And we'll also hear from the Social Progress Group on interesting work being done in cities around the world to measure and manage for outcomes. Our goal for these sessions is to have our city leaders come together to build better financial and programmatic strategies linked to intended goals for all of Philadelphians. And we want to do this in a very transparent and public way so everyone understands what's going on, what we're doing, how this is going to work. Today's just a starting point. I look forward to many hearings ahead of us. I want to thank all my colleagues who are attending today, and thank you to those who have agreed to testify. Thank you also all for your patience today, and I look forward to what you have to say, so let's get started. Ms. Gerbach, please call the first panel of witnesses.
Harvey Rice.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Dom and members of the City Council Fiscal Stability and Intergovernmental Cooperation Committee. My name is Harvey Rice. I am the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Intergovernmental Cooperation Authority, known as PICA. Thank you for allowing me to testify today to speak about the city's fiscal year 2021 to fiscal year 2025 5-year plan, which the PICA board considered and unanimously approved just last week. As you know, PICA was created in 1991 as an oversight agency to the city as a result of the fiscal crisis the city was facing at that time. PICA is governed by a 5-member board appointed by state officials in accordance with the PICA Act. At that time, PICA provided funding to eliminate the city's accumulated general fund deficit, allowed access to capital markets, and to restore investor confidence in the city. In addition, we oversaw the creation of a new long-term financial planning process designed to impose budgetary discipline on the city. As a result of establishing PICA, the city also obtained authorization to levy a 1% local sales tax to help balance its budget. And as long as PICA exists, the city cannot file for bankruptcy protection under Chapter 9 of the Federal Code. The PICA Act requires that plans present balanced budgets in each of their 5 years or include measures that are sufficient to eliminate any projected deficits. In addition, revenue projections must be based on reasonable assumptions and an appropriate methodology. I have prepared a short PowerPoint presentation that describes not only the 5-year plan process, but this current plan process, our evaluation of the plan, and our identification of some key risks and some concerns that can impact the city's plan over the next 5 years. Okay, this is our plan process, which I already discussed. So here's our slide on what the general fund revenue was presented in the 5-year plan. And as you can see, for fiscal 21, almost 73% of the revenues come from taxes. And then it's broken out to locally generated non-tax revenues, revenues from other governments, and revenues from funds. On the right-hand side, you'll see general fund revenue projections over the course of the 5 years. And that's also broken out by the same sectors: revenues from other funds, revenues from other governments, locally generated non-tax revenues, and taxes. And you can see them increasing as the years go forward. Then we take what the expenditures are to actually spend that money that the city takes in. And we separate it into sectors, and we call them service sectors. And these are sectors that PICA has established for a better process for us to review and analyze the 5-year plan. So as you can see, the largest sector is employee benefits, and that includes the pension as well as the other employee benefits such as health care, unemployment, disability, and some other benefits included. Then the second largest piece of the pie chart is public safety, which includes police and fire. And then it just breaks down. Judicial and corrections is the district attorney's office. It's the first judicial district and the prisons. Then health and human services is the Department of Human Services, health and behavioral health and smaller and homeless services. And then regulation and economic development is commerce, and L&I are the big factors in that. And it goes down. Arts and culture and recreation is recreation, payments to arts facilities, as well as the library. Transportation and sanitation is totally streets. Central services is, what is it? OIT, public property, and fleet management. And then governance administration is basically everything else: the mayor's office, city council, city controller, some of the other row offices. And this is all broken out in our 5-year plan report, our staff report, and then education, employee benefits, and others. So then as we're reviewing and analyzing the plan, even though we recommended approval of the plan, we saw some risk that if they took place would be risks to the budget going forward, either in 21 or throughout the life of the plan. Obviously, the major risk was the impact of COVID-19, and as Councilman Dom said, it's unprecedented. There's really nothing to compare this to or to build off of. And because of the revenue impact that the city saw in the last quarter of fiscal year 20, plus the added expenses that the city incurred because of COVID-19, and going forward, trying to figure out when this will end and recovery will take place, is very difficult to project. As a part of that and it goes hand in hand, is economic growth. Then we saw the low fund balances as a risk, the business income and receipts tax projections, and pension funding. So the COVID-19 impact, as I mentioned, and through the first 3 quarters, the city was 7.1% over and above in revenues, tax collections, than they were the prior year. Through the last quarter, they're down 7.3%. So that is a telling example of the impact of COVID-19 on the city's budget and the city's local economy. It's not working. Oh, here it is. Okay, on the federal on the 2021 budget, we had a lower starting fund balance because the city incurred $84 to $85 million in unprojected or unexpected expenses because of the impact on COVID-19 in 2020. Revenues were reduced in 2020 by $635 million, and then there's a projected increase just cost for COVID-19 of $30 million for 2021. Which gives you a total gap of almost $750 million. Okay, so on the economic growth, what we looked at, we review all the city's revenue projections, and this is a process that just doesn't begin when we receive the plan, which this year was June 29th. This starts back in January as we work with the city, and we hold a economist meeting in February where we bring economists and professors of economy and other people in the business industry together at the Federal Reserve. And the city puts forward what they think their projections will be for the next plan that they will be issuing as a proposed plan in March and then later in June. And then we all come together and we listen to the city's economists, their consultants, as well as the city's budget director and finance director, and we open it up, and they receive feedback of whether they're on target, what could be amiss, and then the city sometimes will then go back and rework it or tweak it if needed, and then those numbers are presented in the budget and the plan that the city issues in March of that year. This year was somewhat different, and as we went forward, the city needed to revise their plan on May 1st, and then again their plan was revised when we received it on June 29th. So during that course, we work with our economists on the city's revenue projections to make sure that they are reasonable and appropriate according to the PICA Act. And what this slide shows you and these are just the total revenue projections for all the taxes over the course of the 5-year plan. So the difference in fiscal year 21 was $126.5 million. That's overall taxes. BERT is about 90 million of that. In 2022, it drops, but it's still a negative difference of 73.7, and then in 23, it drops even lower to 55.8, and then in 24, it rises of $500,000, and then in 25, 84.7 million. But what's telling, I believe, in all this is over the 5 years, our projections compared to the city's projections over the course of the 5 years, over $19 billion, we're only $170 million short. But in saying that, what was concerning to us was that we were short significantly in the first 2 years. And if our projections on BERT came to fruition, then the city would possibly go into negative fund balances, and I can talk about that a little later on another slide. So the fund balance is a risk. It's been a risk, but the city has been, until this year, the city has been making steady movement in having larger fund balances. And because of the larger fund balance they had last year going into 2020, I think it lessened the impact of COVID-19 on fiscal year 20 as well as fiscal year 21 and going forward. In saying that, the fund balances going forward are not like where we want to see them. We haven't seen these in the last few years. We have a fund balance of 51 million next year, this year, 50 million in 22. Then it starts to rise a little bit, drops in 24 to 117, and then ends at at 229 million. These are not where the city has their projections of 6 to 8%, and obviously they're nowhere near the GFOA's recommendation of 17% of expenditures. So this slide shows you where we should be, and the green line is under the GFOA recommendations. The orange or red line is the city's target. The blue line is actually where we are. And then if you add the total, the other reserves, the labor reserves and the recession reserve, then that's the yellow line. So you're getting closer through the plan period to the city's projections, the city's 6 to 8% goal. So the major factor that drove us in our concerns among the revenue projections was BERT. As you can see, in the first year, we were $100 million lower than the city's projections for BERT. And then in the second year, in 2022, we were even a little higher, about 110 million. So taking that into consideration, as I mentioned before, we were concerned of what that would do to the city's budget, especially this fiscal year and in fiscal 22. So this slide shows you the potential impact on the fund balance. Now, as I said, the major driving force was BERT, but to give you a total view, this is, we took all the different tax revenue numbers, so that if you start with the fund balance of 51.4 million for 2021, and you take all the revenue shortfalls between the city's projections and our projections, 126.5. If they all come into fruition, then the city would possibly have a negative fund balance of 75.1 in 21. Take that further into 22, 22.8, but then it starts to rebound in 23 and 24 and 25. So as a result, and in accordance with PICA's act and statute, and the cooperation that we have and that we believe we need to have with the city to make sure that their budget is always balanced, and that going forward they have enough revenue to take care of the services that the citizens demand. So we said to the city, unless you review your projections for BERT and see where we are, if we can meet or not, and that they're pretty firm with their projections. And so I said, we went back to them and said, well, it would be difficult for me to recommend approval if I know that our projections, if could put this budget into deficit in in the next 2 fiscal years. So the city said, and as we did also we did the same process in fiscal 13 in 2012. I wasn't here at the time, and but I remember from my being in the controller's office. So the city put forward a contingency measures of what they would do if their revenues are not coming in the projections. Now, we monitor their revenues every month. We receive a quarterly report, not only on revenues as well, but as also on expenditures. However, as part of our part of our plan approval process, the PICA board requested and the city agreed that they would, on a monthly basis, provide us not only revenues, but expenditures by department so that we can make sure that the city is spending within their means going forward. And if they're not, that creates a variance. And if that variance is created, then PICA will say to the city, will mandate to the city, you need to revise your plan to make up for this variance. So everyone should keep that in mind, that this is the process that we've been following, and I think that served both the city and PICA well over these so many years. So taking that into consideration, they came with $88.8 million of contingencies for 21, would, if needed, would bring their fund balance down to 23.7, then in 22, 74.3 to 23.8, and then going forward, we have higher fund balances. Some of their contingency measures included savings in the debt service, reopening, and the recession reserve, using that over the course of the years, and CARES Act reimbursement, making sure that they do the best job possible to pay for, out of the CARES Act reimbursement, for services that are coming out of the general fund, but that could be directly correlated to CARES Act requirements. Then another risk, as you have seen in our past staff reports, is the pension fund and the pension cost. And while the city has made significant movements into reducing the increased liability and fully funded by the year 2033, 2034, because of COVID-19 and the fluctuation of the stock market right now and the economy, we still left it as a risk because we just don't know what the investment returns will be, and whether that funded liability will grow or just stay where, according to the city's actuary. And then, why they don't rise to the level of risk, there's other financial concerns that we saw in this plan. Future labor cost. The city has put aside $200 million over the 5 years for labor costs. As you know, all labor contracts are up in FY21. And so they're all going to either be arbitrated or negotiated. And so the city put money aside for each year. We looked at it more conservatively, because there's no labor costs for exempt and non-rep pay, one lump sums that sometimes are required under some arbitration or labor contracts. So in there, we were about 55 million more than what the city has put aside. And speculative revenues, there are revenues that the city thinks that they will receive money on, such as sale of city properties, reimbursements, fines, and from the parking authority, L&I fines. And so looking at that, we just thought we really want to keep a special eye on them. School District of Philadelphia, like every other government, they're going through the same crisis as we are, and state governments are. And because of the City Council and the City Administration's commitment to public school education and the School District of Philadelphia, and the impact of real estate tax, if it doesn't come in according to projections, we listed that as a concern. Employee health benefit costs, they keep on rising. They're hard to project. And we just think that we're a little bit more, we see them rising a little higher than the city as projected. And then a budget stabilization reserve. Last year's plan, there was a budget stabilization reserve in every year of the 5 years. Fortunately, we had 1 year that they're able to use that to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 for FY21. However, we don't see a contribution to the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund until the last year of the plan, FY25. And then we look at some key financial and management issues, overtime costs and staffing. As you know, PICA and the PICA board has been concerned about the increased rise in overtime cost. It's projected to be about $213 million. Depending on reimbursements, it might be a little high. However, this is the highest we've seen for at least 10 years that we've been tracking the overtime. And overtime costs that are not monitored, that are not handled appropriately, robs money from others that could be needed for other city services. And as a result, at our public meeting on the 5-year plan, the city has agreed to present PICA, submit to PICA and by September, early fall, an overtime reduction plan. And that's another vehicle another form that PICA will monitor, as we have been, to try to get these overtime costs down. Now, when we started looking at this issue, one of the reasons we were told why overtime costs were high is that staffing levels were low, so it was difficult to get added staff. So as that process takes some time, other people need to fill in and to complete those needed services on overtime. Well, that takes us to staffing. Well, we're at the highest level of staffing that we've had since before the Great Recession of 2008. So as staffing levels have grown, so has overtime. It presents a question of what is the cause of overtime? If it's not because of staffing, then what is causing this overtime to rise? And hopefully we will see that in the overtime reduction plan that the city is going to submit to us in September. And then these are public PICA publications that we forward to the citizens and city council. And I'm here to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay. Thank you, Director.
No, I had
Testimony. I just want to recognize Council Members Gim and Heenan. And if council members have questions, I ask that you let me know by writing in the chat feature. But I have a few questions for you, Director. First, I'd like to ask. Can you go back to that staffing chart? I just want to make sure I understood that.
Sure. Can't find it, guys. I can't find it. I got it.
There it is. I just want to make sure I'm clear on this staffing chart. It says that in the current year, fiscal year, I guess, 20, the past year, it was 22,325 staffed. So
yes, Council First.
Are we going to add over 1,600 employees in the new budget?
That was in the budget.
That was in their budget.
Okay. That seems like
It
a big
doesn't mean that they all will become employees.
I mean, when you look at the graph, I mean, just looking from 09 it looks like we've fluctuated from '09 through even 19 in the 21 to 20,000 employees, and now all of a sudden we're shooting up in a recession time to almost 24,000.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm sure Rob will have an answer for that one. Let me answer my next question. I noticed this year, in your statement, you said you're not just going to track revenues going forward, you're also going to track expenditures, which I think is great.
Ma'am.
Do you have monthly targets for those expenditures, and so we know if we're in trouble, including the revenues too, so that we can deal with this on a monthly basis?
Now we'll be getting it.
Right. We're in the process of working with the city on how we're going to get that information, and by department, and it will start out with projections. What we'll probably do is we get the last quarter of the QCMR for 2020 in August 17th. We'll be getting it this year, so we'll use that as a jumping point, just to do projections by department, by their budget, and then so that we can each month, as we receive the information, we can track it to whatever that base is.
So I think the tighter we track this, the better it'll be for everybody.
Yes.
So we can see trends, and we can adapt based on those trends. The second question, I'll be real and I can be brief on this, is the council's well aware of the ever-present disparities we see in services and outcomes for all Philadelphians. Everything from policing, education, COVID-19 protection, healthcare, internet access, which we talked about even yesterday. And in the best of times, these disparities based on race and income are rampant across the city. So I'm concerned about what happens in the worst of times, which is probably right now, okay? So we all need to be focused on these issues. I'm just wondering how PICA has incorporated the thoughts on race and equity in their review of the 5-year plan. And in the scenario where your revenue assumptions become reality, how can we protect outcomes and service levels for people without putting the finances in danger?
Well, the first thing we would do is that I know that the racial equity is part of their budget. So as we look at their budget, we're going to look at that part of it to see if they're meeting their goals there, as well as the financial aspect of their budget. So, and then we also look, we receive on a quarterly basis their performance metrics, and we evaluate them, and we try to figure out trends going back and going forward, and we do call the city out on some of their, if they're not meeting their projections. So that the last QCMR, the city did not provide them because of the COVID-19 and the impact of that was doing not only on the budget, but also on staffing and people working from home. And but I expect that we will get those performance metrics again for the last quarter for the whole year on August 17th. And so we can, on the revenues side, as we follow the revenues, we can show light on where those revenues are coming in. And then as we match that, I believe, with the budget, then we can see or we can at least present to the city and city council and they can observe whether there are any disparities, either by neighborhood or by class or by race. So we can attempt to do that going forward.
Okay, thank you. I have one last quick question. That you brought it up, the overtime spending. I guess my issue with overtime isn't the overtime itself, but it's the fact that when we budget overtime, we consistently exceed the budget. And in the last 4 years, I think the numbers are about 140 million of overtime that we've exceeded in the last 4 years. How do we put better controls on that? And has PICA made any recommendations to the administration on how we can better manage that overtime?
We have in some of our overtime reports. And I bring my experience from the city controller's office into that, into those recommendations, that they need tighter controls, they need an approval process, they need a budget in each department, and that if they're going to go over that budget, then they really need to create a reason, a justifiable reason, and then have an approval process to go over that budget from the department as well as the budget and finance department. I remember I was in the controller's office right during 08, 09, and 10, and we kept our overtime budget to, I think it was 50,000. Now we're a smaller agency or department, but once we got to 50,000, first of all, to get to 50,000, we had strict controls in place. And it had to go to the post-audit deputy or the pre-audit deputy, then it had to come to the first deputy, and then working with the budget person in the controller's office. And then once we got to fit, and then I would say to them, well, we're almost there, and the CAFRA isn't done yet, the school district's CAFRA isn't done yet, and you know you're going to have overtime there. So it's just working within each department and putting a system in place. I recall that about a year ago when we issued our report, and a spokesperson for I think the prison said, this is just that overtime is an avenue to supplement their income. Well, that's not the reason for overtime. And we have to change that mindset. And by changing that, by putting controls into place, and by having people in each department stick to those controls and those approval processes, and the budget department working hand in hand with each department on whatever the projected budget is for overtime, staying within that budget, I think we can reduce overtime. And I agree with you, Councilman. That was a problem with ours. Is, well, then just budget it. If you need the money for overtime, just budget it accordingly. But this going over projections year after year after year by a significant amount of money shows that there's lack of control and lack of importance in curtailing overtime.
I mean, I definitely think we need all the help we can get in that area to better control it. So thank you for your testimony. I'd like to turn to my colleagues who have several questions. I'd like to start with Councilmember Derek Green, but before I do, I want to recognize Councilmember Jamie Gautier, who has joined us. So welcome. Councilmember Green. I think Councilmember Green had a question.
Alan, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. Just had a few quick questions. I know that we're going to have Rob Nabeau and Marissa come on, but for Harvey, I just had a question in reference to the difference between the city projections and PICA's projections regarding BERT. What caused the difference?
I think the main difference is that we believe that the economy is going to take a little longer to rebound than the city does. Our economist believes that once a vaccine is in place, then that's when the economy, whether it's in the city, state, or the federal government throughout the country, will rebound. And he doesn't believe, one, that'll happen until July of 2021, about this time next year. And it's, and you got, with BERT is very volatile. It's been a risk in most of our plans the last 3 or 4 years because it's so hard to project. The way it's collected, the time period, 16 months, it's just a very hard tax revenue to project. And then put COVID-19 on top of that, it makes it even more difficult. And because of that, we're a little bit more conservative, and we believe that it's going to take a little longer for the economy to bounce back than I think what the city might be looking at.
And the city's information was based on their numbers from the IHS market, correct?
Correct. Another thing, I think, because Philadelphia is a part of what drives our economy is the medical community, and our economist sees that that is slower than the city projects. That people are putting off either testing or surgeries or even dental checkups until as this crisis has taken hold. And so he believes that that's part of the BERT numbers, why we're a little lower also.
Right, and I can reflect on that from more of an anecdotal perspective. My wife is senior manager at CHOP, and they, even though some of the elective surgeries are starting to come back, they're still not at the revenue levels. And I've seen that in other healthcare institutions where a lot of the revenue that comes in from elective surgeries, people have not been doing that, even though that's now allowed because of the concerns of COVID-19. So I want to then reflect, because my understanding is when PICA approved the 5-year plan, that was based on the contingency that the administration would come back on a monthly basis regarding where revenues and expenses were going.
Right. They're going to provide us on a monthly basis the revenues, which they do according to the Act. We get them every month, right? But they're going to do the expenditures.
Now, in your conversations and during the PICA process, were you able to get information from IHS Markit from them about future projections on a monthly basis, or could they only provide annualized projections regarding the latter parts of this fiscal year or future fiscal years?
Right. We have not received, nor did we request monthly projections. We report on monthly actuals. So, and I don't know if they're able to do that or not. That might be something you could ask Rob to ask IHS.
Right, and that's one of the questions I asked during our budget process because of the concern, which I think was highlighted by the economist information for PICA, that in May the collections were off significantly, and my concern is in future months, even though we've been able to reopen more and we're still in a modified green, and based on the conversation we're having about life sciences and health institutions, hospitals in particular, I have a concern we're not going to meet our revenue estimates, and that's going to cause a ongoing concern, even if we're able to get some type of revenue reimbursement from some of the federal legislation and initiatives that's being discussed in DC, that we may need that money that we may possibly get, not so much for, even though we need it for the revenue that we lost from COVID-19 from March going through now, but we'll need it because the revenue estimates, the actual don't meet the estimates, and we're going to have even bigger issue, which gets to your point about fund balance of $51 million for FY22 or $50 million fund balance for FY22, and that doesn't take into your other data, which actually shows that even less than that.
Right. And just remember, Councilman, that even though they're not giving us monthly projections going forward, they gave us monthly projections. They gave us projections for those taxes. And we know what taxes come in at what period of time. If they're not coming in to the projections at the city and they're below projections, then PICA is going to say to the city, you have a variance. You are not meeting your targets. You got to come back now with another with a revised plan, and either update your projections or update your expenditures.
Right. Okay. I will close with that. Thank you, Harvey, and thank you, Councilmember Donald.
Thank you, Councilmember Green. I guess our next question is from Councilmember Quinones Sanchez.
Thank you. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Good
Harvey,
afternoon.
Thank you for your presentation. I think you answered one of my questions, which was the issue of, I guess the PICA Act did not require for the city to turn in its expenses, and that's why in the past you had not monitored its expenses. Is that part of the Act or not part of the Act?
It's part of the Act for quarterly. So we get those expenses on a quarterly basis. That's part of the act. However, because of the current situation that we're in with COVID-19 and the impact on the city budget, the board wanted to see them on a monthly basis so that we're not waiting for a full quarter. And generally, it's even longer than a quarter because they have 45 days after the quarter ends to provide us the information.
Okay, thank you. Has the administration shared with you what protocols it's using in its reconciliation with COVID-related federal and state funding? I know that we're having a hard time kind of following, what they consider COVID, non-COVID. And so in these discussions, have they given you what protocol they're utilizing to determine a COVID-related reimbursable expense and a non-one?
They presented to us a spreadsheet with some COVID-related expenses. They did not share the criteria of what is deemed a COVID CARES Act related expense.
I strongly encourage PICA to be part of that conversation. There's a lot of discretion in that, and we keep, as we're looking to prioritize or realign priorities based on what we're deeming the new normal, we continue to have some debates about what those COVID-related expenses. So thank you. Your PICA has highlighted the volatility of BERT. Can you speak to, is that on the gross or the net side projections? And if there's anything that is standing out to you that we should be aware of in both of those, since we're, as you know, one of the only 4 jurisdictions that has a gross and a net. What do you see in that volatility?
It's both. But I think what jumped out at us was that the original plan in March, the projections for BERT were lower than the projections that we received in May in the midst of this COVID-19 epidemic, and that they project in FY22 to collect $605 million, I believe, and the most that they've ever collected. And this is during the 10 years of the greatest expansion that this country has seen economically. I think they collected $514 million. So even before we got into the process with our economist and all the research that he does and all the models that he looks at, it was clear to me that we thought that the city was overly optimistic on BERT revenue collections, especially for FY21 and FY22.
Was any justification based on the COVID-related response? Were they looking at there was going to be this infusion of money that was somehow going to turn it? I mean, what was the justification for such a big
I think their first variable was that they believe that the recovery is going to happen quicker than we believe. Secondly, I think they were looking at collections from medical community and the medical businesses, and which I discussed earlier, and our economist and we believe that people are taking their time and getting non-elective tests and surgeries, and that's going to have an impact on the medical businesses.
Okay. And then finally, because I don't want to monopolize the time, although I'm chair of appropriations and I know the chairman will give me a little bit of leeway in this space. When you compare Philadelphia to other cities, the whole debate in the post-COVID Floyd world has been the issue of our budget in the time that I've been here has gone from 25% in the public safety category to 30% in the safety category as it relates to police, fire, courts, and others. How is that a best practice? How does that compare with other cities? If you have that information, if you don't, if you want to come back and respond later,
I don't. But what I can say is, I don't think Philadelphia is the only city grappling with this way money is funded to public agencies such as police, fire. Boston is putting reform.
Can you put up that chart? I just want my colleagues to just look at the variations of funding and what we fund, right? Which is in this post-COVID Floyd conversation, the fact that 2% for arts and very little for education. This one, this budget, right, when you put it in that chart, just speaks to us fueling systems that we are fighting against and really divesting from people that we need to invest in because of the poverty and the deep poverty we have in the city. This is a very glaring. I'm very offended by this chart, and the fact that that's what we say our priorities are in a post-COVID Floyd world. And so I'm just interested in, if you could find some comparison to other cities. I'm embarrassed by this chart. I really am. And it's very hurtful because it really speaks to when we talk about crime and everything else going on in our city. I'm just really flabbergasted by it. And then in terms of best practice in the overtime management, how do we compare to other cities? Because going back to what the chairman spoke to, this overtime abuse, because you could see the bad actors. I mean, literally departments, all they need to do is pull up their census and say, we have 200 people that are making 200% of their salary or 100% of their salary. How do we fare with other cities? And what, if anything, in particular, has PICA, in highlighting this, said to the administration about getting a handle on this? Because it's clearly not measured and not managed.
Right. We've made recommendations to put strict controls in place. We thought that with performance-based budgeting, that would be a vehicle. We don't have
performance-based budgeting. I think we've given up on that. I mean, we've gone through all these different variations. We're not doing that. Even in a COVID budget, we couldn't come up to that process. So I'm sorry. As chair of appropriations, I'm just going to push back completely on that stuff. When goals are like I return calls in 24 hours, that's just really not performance-based budgeting.
Right. I know. We and I agree with you. We've when we get the metrics in the QCMR, we question some, like I would rather know how many after-school programs the recreation department and how many kids they serve in them than how many acres of grass was cut. And that's a personal as well as I think a PICA staff concern is what we measure. But going back to how other cities, we are actually attempting to look at that to see where other cities are in overtime. It's not as easy as it sounds because some cities don't have this department responsibility. Other cities are city counties, and so that their prisons is run by the county. But we just finished our staff report on the plan, and it's the next undertaking that staff is working on to try to see how best we can measure overtime cost with other cities throughout the country.
I know that in the previous administration, at some point they started calling out some of these employees, and it led to a slight reduction by some of those folks. So I'm going to strongly encourage you to work with this committee and our chairman around these issues around overtime and overtime management. Again, when I look at communities like Kensington, and the fact that we're not willing to invest in the people of Kensington, but we continue to run up public safety. We're in a reactionary mode, right? And part of moving from crisis to recovery is management, right? And I just don't see it when you have a budget and only 8% reflects our investment in people and health and human services, 1% in economic development, and we're sitting here saying that we need revenue to get to recovery. Again, this is a very telling slide. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to the rest of the hearing and an ongoing discussion with PICA around how we get a handle on this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. And I want to recognize Council Member Mark Zuella, who's joined us. And the next question is from Council Member Curtis Jones, Jr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for pulling together this very important hearing. I want to just say that retrospectively, I go back to a guy by the name of Carlo Gambetta, who was the finance director way back in the day. And I say that because I remember a fiscal time pre-PICA where we were in rooms deciding every Monday what vendors we were going to pay because we didn't have money in the actual operating account to pay everyone. So we are in a very different space today. I would also go on and say that this council, and I've been a part of a number of councils, I've matched with any other council I've served on by way of being at least fiscally conscious. Now, where we prioritize our spending will differ, but we do count our pennies. So I guess what I want to say is, in my review of what you presented today, I thought not only was the city of Philadelphia optimistic about our recovery, but you may be a bit optimistic about our recovery as well, because of the variable, if this pandemic is not answered with a vaccine, there are small businesses in the city of Philadelphia that are holding on by fingernails. And we're not just talking about the pandemic, but come back ever at all. And so I guess the punchline of what I'm trying to get to is I would love to, going forward, Mr. Chairman, get a committee that is diverse in perspective, not necessarily, but in perspective, to be a part of your annual economist workshop debate about the future of the city. And that serves two purposes. One, it gives us early warning about what some of the titans may view as problems on the horizon or opportunities on the horizon. One other thing, that if this vaccine does work, there might be cottage industries that are developed, whether it's tracing, whether it's distribution of vaccines, whether it is how we even do maintenance in subways, and how we up our game by way of cooking. So there might be, in China they say every crisis, the same word is opportunity. So in your guesstimate as to where we're going, are we factoring how pivotal this vaccine development is for our local economy?
So all good points. I mean, it's something we can probably look at going forward.
So beyond good points, I really want to make sure that we are in the room, council-wise, because we also serve as a juxtaposition to some of the things that are maybe spent on the second floor. And so with that three-legged approach, I like what we're doing quarterly, but I really would love to hear it from some of the folk who have a broader perspective on Philadelphia and its positioning post-pandemic, eds and meds being a driver, and what that could mean for our rebound.
Are you suggesting, Councilmember Jones, that we have maybe our own economists from our perspective to look at this?
I would say both. I really was intrigued when they talked about bringing all of these forecasters in a room to help PICA. I thought that was forward thinking, and I'd love for us to be a fly on the wall and listen to some of that in its raw form, so that we might be able to help out as the fiscal year goes by on adjustments. So, I mean, when for example, when you talked about overtime in a pandemic year, if you look at what's going on in the streets department, I think one quarter of their workforce is out. And so they are, I have trash in front of my house right now. So as we look at how they augment that, they have two choices. They can hire some more trash collectors or sanitation workers, or they can pay overtime. And this is a delicate balance that it depends on where you sit. I sit in the city of Philadelphia where my trash hasn't been picked up in a week. So I think better information going back and forth might be better communications in the long run, and then better decisions ultimately.
Okay. You bring up an interesting question I want to ask Director Rice. Your consultant, when they did this analysis, had to pick a date, I assume, for when the vaccine might occur. Do we know the dates of when you think the vaccine might occur versus the cities?
I don't know what the cities is, but he believes that a vaccine, it would take a year from the time of his analysis, which was in July. It was early July. So he doesn't believe it will take effect until at least this time next year, which would be July of 2022.
And you know the city's determination on that? We can find out.
Don't. Okay. I don't know. I know. I think theirs was shorter, but I don't know the exact. It might be January. But I would ask them. I don't know the exact date or month.
All right, Councilmember Jones. Any other questions? Or are you okay?
No, I just want to be. If you would provide the chair some dates where he can pick some people from the committee just to be in attendance. So as these discussions come about, a Maria Sanchez lens or Councilmember Brooks's lens might be offered in a pie chart so that we can better measure some of these other measurements that are important to us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember. Those are good ideas, Director Rice. Hopefully we can be included. Let's go to
thank you.
Councilmember Gilmore Richardson had a question.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Rice, for your testimony. I just wanted to circle back to two things. In February, before the pandemic began, I had introduced a resolution calling for a hearing of this same committee to discuss our city's preparedness for recession and also the strength of our Reserve Stabilization Fund. And Mr. Rice, you had testified that Philadelphia was not prepared to deal with a severe economic recession without significant support from the state and federal government. So I just wanted to circle back on the federal reimbursement and what PICA's position is relative to the reimbursements the city has been able to achieve thus far. And then secondly, I just wanted to confirm, I thought I heard you state that PICA is recommending the city to make a contribution to our budget stabilization reserve fund in FY25.
That's the city has put that in their 5-year plan. It wasn't our recommendation. That was included by the city in their 5-year plan submitted to us June 29th.
Sure. What was PICA's recommendation for when those contributions should resume, or have you taken a position on that one way or the other?
Well, we've taken a position that and we've been taking a position and going back a few years that the city should follow the council ordinance that was put forward in 2011 and put money into the Budget Stabilization Reserve Fund for such events as we're experiencing right now. And however, in taking all that, you have to weigh it with, well, do we just put money away and we have problems that we're experiencing right now, such as a high poverty rate, such as a high violence rate, and such as money that the school district needs to educate our children. So it's a balance. And as fiscal watchdogs, we push for those budget stabilization reserve funds and rainy day funds, as we've seen where it's occurring now. but also you have to weigh when you have the largest poverty rate of all the major cities in the country, and you want to make sure that your kids are educated and the state isn't coming forward with appropriate funding. The city has to weigh that, and I think that's why it took a few years for them to as we saw in last year's plan, to put a budget stabilization reserve fund in every year. If the COVID-19 didn't hit, I believe that would have continued into this plan and future plans.
Thank you. And then also just PICA's position relative to the federal reimbursement the city has received thus far in this process.
I think I would agree with the city that it's not enough, but we have a federal administration who really looks like they don't care about urban centers and cities, and obviously the pandemic, and so I think the city is doing everything they can to maximize the money that can come into Philadelphia, and then using that money as best they can appropriately for COVID-19 costs and expenses, so it takes less out of the general fund.
Thank you. And then lastly, just in comparison to the 2008 recession as it relates to our budgeted positions, as of right now, based on FY 2009 versus FY 21 proposed positions, we're up almost 2,500 positions, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Rice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, council member. The next question is from council member Zuella.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. And I think it's important, too, to have all council members here listening to this to see how important it is with appropriations, finance, commerce and economic development, and then fiscal stability, understanding that all this actually works together to make the city run. But my main concern is looking at the projections of the revenue. I know Councilmember Sanchez and Councilmember Green brought this up. The city projected income and revenue, but we're really not opening up. It doesn't seem as being projected. So knowing that, and PICA is still approving the budget, is that something that we have to do back in August or September to evaluate this and resubmit a budget?
Not necessarily. When the BERT numbers come in for the collections for FY20 for 20, and we probably won't see the full effect till September. If those numbers are significantly lower, it would create a variance, and then we would go back to the city and say you got to readjust your projections for BERT or for any other tax, and give us a revised plan. That is the significant structure of PICA over this the oversight on the city, is that if their projections of revenue or their expenses or something occurs and they can't afford that, or the projections for revenue aren't coming in, then we go to them, this is a variance to your plan, please revise the plan so that we make sure that the plan is balanced, and the board then will vote on that again.
But at that point, the budget is already approved, right? And so it's not like to go back and reapprove the budget, so they just have to come up with a plan, submit it to PICA, and then if you guys don't approve it, what are the consequences?
Well, if we don't approve it, we need to give the city reasons why we don't approve it. And then they have a certain amount of days, I think it's 15, to come back to us and make adjustments to correct what we pointed out to them. If they don't do that, or if they do that and it's not in accordance with what PICA's requests were, and they reject the plan, then at that point, it could start the process of some state funding. There are a lot of exceptions to it, but some state funding stop in coming to Philadelphia until they present a plan that PICA approves and that it's balanced for the budget for the year that we're for FY21, say, and going forward.
All right, looking at the city's plan of proposed revenue, you guys, when PICA looks at that and maybe has some questions about it, goes back to the city, do you see that as being generous when you're looking at it and say maybe you have to revise that at that time, or you're still going to wait and take a wait and see approach?
No, what we did, Councilman, what you're speaking about is exactly what occurred this time. When we were going through the process, and putting it all in context, over 5 years, we were only $170 million difference from our projections to the city's projections out of $19 billion. So it's less than 1%. But saying all that, FY21 and FY22, they were significant because of the BERT. So we went to the city and we said, our BERT numbers are this, your BERT numbers are that. This is the reason why our BERT numbers are. We don't think the recovery is going to occur till sometime in late 21, 22, and some reasons. And they came and said they were going to stand by their numbers. And then we said to them, well, then, as a staff and as the executive director, I can't recommend approval to the board of this plan, because if our projections are the ones that are met, then this is going to throw your budget for 21 and possibly 22 into deficit and a deficit fund balance. And we can't allow that according to PICA and according to the Act. So that's when the city submitted some contingency reductions that they would make as we go forward into this this fiscal year. And and then as a part of that, we're going to be monitoring every monthly, not only revenues, but also expenditures. So we're trying to put as many safeguards into place that if there's a train wreck coming, we're going to see it as early as we can.
All right, so sort of a safeguard in place so that if you see that the projections are way off, the city would then have to go back and calibrate and then do the reductions in expenses that they already have submitted in case this happens. Is that correct?
Correct.
And out of those reductions, are those reductions in mainly employee and overtime, or is it in department expenses?
It's various reductions. There's reductions in debt service costs. They're going to use the reopening and recession reserve, part of that. They're going to eliminate the labor reserve, the $25 million for FY22. They're going to shift some costs to the COVID and the CARES Act. They're going to do a clawback on some capital spending that they've already, out of the pay-as-you-go, that they've already committed to, and certain other various measures that they've put into place that they would implement if needed.
Okay, because I do believe that obviously this budget is passed, and even though it was difficult, I think next year is probably going to be one of the most difficult, and 2022 as a challenge of trying to put this together. So I think it's good that, is it possible that you could work with our chair as these monthly meetings go on to see where we're at in real time so that council can react and be able to assist or help during this time?
Absolutely. We will provide, once we get into the process of what the city will be providing us, what we're going to measure it against, the base and everything, we will provide that information as timely as we can, and you'll get that every month. The revenues as well as our monitoring the city spending.
All right, Harvey. Thank you very much. Thank you for your
You're
time.
welcome.
Thank you, Councilmember Zuella. And now we have Majority Leader Sherelle Parker has a question.
Thank you, Chairman Dom, and good afternoon, Harvey. It's great to see you.
Nice to see you.
Appreciation and value for your work. This is being broadcast live, and this pie chart that we are looking at now, there are members of the public who are viewing this, and they are saying for the very first time, those who may be tuning in because they're home when they would normally be at work, and they're saying, wow. Is this how the city of Philadelphia spends its money? Harvey, I want you, for the benefit of the public, if you will, to explain whether or not the education piece of the pie that's included on this slide, this doesn't include contributions to the school district or community.
It does not. No,
or
that's just the education funding for the Office of Education in the mayor's office. That does not include the contributions to the school district that the city and city council has voted on, nor does it include the taxes that go from the real estate tax and the other taxes to the school district.
Thank you, Harvey, so very much for that clarification, because I could hear by my telephone ringing this evening.
Sorry. I'm sorry I left that up.
For me, Harvey.
You're welcome.
Can you go back to that pie chart?
Sure.
Thank you.
Here we go.
Okay, and so again, just to clarify for the record, there are none of the contributions going directly to the school district of Philadelphia or CCP or investments that we've been made are included in here. This was just described
correct.
As that referring to sort of the administrative portion, right? Relative to the, okay. And also when we look at
that, the school district contributions and the money, that's in the other piece of the pie, the other with the 18%, the top left.
Oh, okay. Okay, so that is included in other. Okay, so for the benefit of the public, I don't want you leaving here thinking that the City Council of Philadelphia, PICA, or anyone, our commitment to education is not reflected here. And Harvey, do the same for me if you can when we're talking about health and human services. That doesn't include any non-general fund dollars, right? Right here where you say... It does
not. It doesn't include the grant money that DHS receives in any other departments within that sector.
Okay.
This is only general fund expenses.
Okay, only general fund. Thank you so much. I just wanted to clear that up for the record.
You're welcome.
I also want to go to something else that you said that was extremely important to me, Harvey, when you talked about what is measured. Sometimes I get a little frustrated when we hear, sort of technical bureaucrats talking about these different types of budgeting, right? And so we hear about zero-based budgeting, and then there's performance-based budgeting. And, so when we're thinking about performance-based and distinguishing that between line items like show the very bare minimum, right? The salaries, the benefits, the office supplies, the travel, etc. But when we're talking about performance-based budget, showing what each dollar accomplishes, in essence, measuring results, that becomes much more attractive. But I'll be quite honest, Harvey, in this day and age, I also believe that even the performance-based budgeting is not sufficient. And I am thoroughly excited, and I want to get your perspective, because we know that you live this econ sort of thinking on a daily basis, and we're going to hear from them. Happy to hear that we are going to be considering this social progress index, right? So instead of also even just talking about what we're actually measuring, now we're figuring out how we're really impacting people's lives. And in our desire to see people have access to equitable opportunities. So I want you, if you will, from PICA's perspective, because we participated in a briefing that was held. I think we just did it last week. It was resolved. It was Jeff Hornstein and some folks from SPI. Tell us, Harvey, if anything, do you know about this process, and what would your perspective be if Philadelphia sort of, in essence, applied an SPI index to its overall budgeting process?
Well, first thing, Councilman, I'd like to learn more about it, and I'm willing to do that, and then evaluate it, and whatever works, we would, and whatever works, delivers city services equitably to the citizens of Philadelphia, and keeps the city's budget and 5-year plan balanced, then we would be happy to review that and learn more about it and take into consideration as we review the city's reports that they submit to us, as well as the 5-year plan.
Got it. Thank you, Harvey. My final question, Harvey, is in regards to PICA reauthorization. I know, Pew held this conversation. We have offline held some conversations with some friends I talked to in Harrisburg. Councilman Green, introduced the resolution, the hearing to just talk about PICA's future. Particularly now, in this moment, if there was ever a time that Philadelphia in its budget process needed some checks and balances to ensure that we were not just budgeting effectively and efficiently, but obviously warding out any waste, fraud, and abuse where we see it, and someone sort of double checking our work, I think is now. And I want you to tell me, is there anything new about PICA's discussion around PICA's potential reauthorization? I've been hearing people say reform it. I don't think that those people, when they talk about significant reforms, they know what reform means when they talk about doing it in the General Assembly and what could potentially happen, particularly given the impact of our wage tax and that non-residents wage tax, and you know where it comes from with that Sterling Act and the kind of folly and mischief that has constantly been stoked when we talk about that. So is there any kind of updates that you can give us, Harvey, or conversations that have taken place around this issue? I
haven't heard any more updates since the Pew convening that we attended to. We attended and I spoke at, and the consensus, I think, from everyone that were on the two panels was that PICA should be extended. I question what they mean by reform measures, because
right, me too,
if you look at the last 20 years or 20-some years, PICA has done exactly what the visionaries who created the statute planned. We got the city through the crisis of 08, 09. We're getting them through the crisis. We're doing our job. We're checking on them. We have our own economist. We are, and the city has balanced budgets. In the last few years, with the help of the administration, the help of city council, before COVID-19, we were seeing fund balances of over $300 million, and contributions to the BSR, and more social programs to address the poverty and those issues that are connected to that. So I don't know when they talk about reform, what reform measures they would do, because as I always say, and maybe because I'm here, so it's a little self-serving, but if it ain't broke, you don't need to fix it. And right. I think PICA is doing its job. It's working with the city. It's holding the city to balanced budgets and to a good economic future. And I think it's, hopefully it gets extended. I probably won't be here, but I think someone should be here to help the city as they go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this will be my last comment. One, Harvey, I want to formally just say thank you for putting that on the record relative to reform. It was interesting. When the discussion happened with Pew, I remember reading some comment that was written in some newspaper story, and it said, in essence, we should be doing away with PICA because it, in essence, has done what it was supposed to do. And now the city of Philadelphia is in a position where we can just do this on our own. And I thought to myself, when I read that quote, I said to myself, wow, I really wish that person could travel to Harrisburg to figure out how challenging and difficult it is. And if we say reform and it is open up, they don't know what they would be potentially doing. Finally, Harvey, pensions. You talk about pension costs, something I've been extremely actively engaged in. I was really pleased this year to know that Philly had won the GFOA's award for excellence in government and finance, and is on the road to pension recovery. And you know we didn't get there easily. You remember the work we did in Harrisburg and having to increase the sales tax to generate a sustainable revenue fund to help to make contributions to it. Tell us, if you will, what your thoughts are about the efforts that the pension fund has put forward.
Well, as we mentioned in our staff report and at various times, PICA was also, it was the first report I issued when I took over as executive director in January of 14, was our report on the pension plan. And we had many recommendations in there. And it's to the city's credit and their commitment, both by the administration and both by council, because I watched those hearings. They've put reform measures in. They got higher contributions rates from employees. They've restructured their investment portfolio and the hedge funds, and they're saving costs there. They're committing more money over the MOU.
MMO, right? Yeah.
To bring that funded liability. So they've adjusted their rate of return. They're lowering that to more conservative. So they are seriously about restructuring the pension fund and getting it to in 2033 or 2034 to almost full funding. And
thank you, Harvey. I appreciate it. Thank you, Chairman Dom.
Thank you, Majority Leader Parker, for your questions. And I want to also welcome Council President Clark to the meeting. Welcome. Good afternoon. And I believe Council Member Gim has a question.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate your holding this. Hello, Harvey. Thank you for your
Good
work.
afternoon.
Good afternoon. So I wanted to ask a little bit about PICA's report and its inclusion of the School District of Philadelphia and its looming billion-dollar deficit. The fact that 50% of every single new dollar now goes towards charter school spending, and then the likely growth of cyber charters as a projected burden on the city of Philadelphia's finances because the school district cannot raise its own revenues.
Correct.
I'm wondering how you typically involve the school district finances into your assessment of the city of Philadelphia's economic security.
We look at their 5-year plan. That's our first step to see where they're spending their money, if there's going to be a deficit. Because if there's going to be a deficit, then we know, because of city council and the administration's commitment to public education and to the school district, that might put a strain upon the city's budget as we go through and do our review and analysis of the city's 5-year plan. We don't have the ability nor the authority to oversee or approve or make recommendations to their budget. and their 5-year plan. However, we do take what that is and consider it into our review and analysis, because that will potentially put strain and pressure upon the city to fund those areas where they might be in faulting.
Right. So one of the concerns that I would have is that, the district has repeatedly pointed to the expense of charters and the lack of support from Harrisburg to do charter school reimbursements or to alleviate any of the burden that charters are applying. And again, the data from the district is that 50% of every new dollar into the district goes towards a charter school, and not towards the school district of Philadelphia as a managing entity. So, we've also had serious situations where the facilities crisis that is currently in the Philadelphia public schools, and is probably one of the top reasons why the district is going entirely virtually online as of September, is a major issue, and continues to be a major issue. And then, other entities like Moody's in, say, 2012, they also don't have jurisdiction or approve finances, but they do weigh in and say that, massive disinvestments, increasing charter expenses were taking the school district of Philadelphia into a serious direction. And would urge PICA to take this on, because, as I said, I think this year's the budget that was submitted to the city of Philadelphia for FY 2021 would have indicated a significantly alarming 5-year budgetary projection that I didn't think was appropriately included in some of the conversations about what the future will look like.
No, I agree, and I would be very willing to sit with the school district if they're willing, and go over their budget and what is the stress on their budget, and how that would affect, and then take that, how it would affect the city's budget, and then opine on that at that time. Because if there's going to be a stress on the city's budget, as we've said in our report, it's a concern. The more information we have, the better argument we can make.
Thank you. I just think it's important for PICA to have somebody who weighs in on the educational expense front. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Councilmember Gam. And Director Rice, I just want to summarize what I think I understand the situation is. I think you have a consultant and the city has a consultant. The city's consultant had a difference of opinion than the PICA consultant. And that difference of opinion was in the first 2 years of revenue projections, and the difference was about $126 million. But in the scope of the total amount of money over a 5-year plan of $19 billion, it's 1%. So your concerns are the first 2 years, and you've asked the city to give you a contingency plan to deal with those first 2 years, if that happens.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think that's the summary of what I've gleaned from this so far, and I know we're going to hear from the administration. But I want to thank you, Director Rice, for being here today and for your ongoing oversight of our city's finances. No question that we definitely need you, and I hope that we can also participate, as Councilmember Jones talked about, in some of those meetings. We hope to have you back here real soon, so thank you very much, Director Rice. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate being here and being with you today.
Thank you. Ms. Gerbach, can you please call the second panel of witnesses?
Rob DeBoe and Marissa Waxman.
Rob and Marissa, I'm going to, because of time, I'm going to ask you both just to go right into your testimony, and then we'll have some questions.
Okay. Good afternoon, Chair Dom and members of the Committee on Fiscal Stability. I'm Rob DeBoe, the Finance Director for the city, and I'm joined by Budget Director Marissa Waxman. We're here to provide testimony on resolution number 200406 to discuss the fiscal position, overarching social impacts of the city's 21 budget as approved by council, and the 21 to 25 5-year plan, which was unanimously approved by PICA on July 21st. I'm going to actually skip over the part of the budget, the part of the testimony that talks about the budget process, because you all lived through that, and I'm going to talk about what's happened with PICA. So after the budget was passed, we submitted an updated FY21 to FY25 five-year plan to PICA. We made adjustments to the plan for things that had happened during the budget process. We had also already begun, as Harvey said, working with PICA and its economic consultant to communicate the assumptions underpinning our plan, particularly for tax revenue estimates. The city, as it's done in the past, used IHS Markit, a global econometric consulting firm. They also serve the same role for the Commonwealth and for numerous other cities and states. And they've built up an understanding of our local economy and conditions through years of working with us. PICA engaged its own economist, Temple Professor Charles Swanson, and PICA, in collaboration with the Federal Reserve, convened an additional gathering of economists to discuss both sets of projections. We continued assessing new insights and data. We did a survey of BERT payers to assess their optimism or pessimism about the future. We reviewed analysis from the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission of which sectors were operating in each phase of the shutdown. We used internal and external data about economic conditions and other guidance. Ultimately, the city's economists and PICA's economists for projections, as you just mentioned, were very similar over the 5 years, with only about a 1% variation. They were particularly aligned on projections for the wage tax, our largest revenue stream, which both included expected losses from commuters continuing to work remotely even after the pandemic ends. There were, however, differences between the two set of projections in the timing of collections, and with the city projecting higher collections from the BERT and PICA projecting higher sales and parking tax than the city projected. Given the sheer scale of the economic shock from COVID-19 and the uncertainty related to the path of the virus, it's not surprising there were a range of reasonable assumptions about where we were headed and when. In fact, I think it's probably more surprising that over the 5 years, our economists were so close to each other. As PICA staff reviewed the 5-year plan, in order to make recommendations for or against approval, they requested an addendum to the plan to outline what steps the city would take if actual collections were closer to their economist projections than to the city's. This addendum process was similar to one that had been used back in FY13, as Harvey mentioned, when PICA staff identified greater than usual risks to the plan. Using PICA's projections, the plan would have wound up in the red for both FY21 and FY22. To balance the plan, we needed to bridge $75 million in 21 and $22 million in FY22 for a total of $97 million. We also, though, didn't want to end up with just a zero fund balance, so we structured the plan to have some remaining fund balance. The addendum had to be developed in less than a week to meet the timetable for PICA's board's consideration. We again engaged an internal budget equity committee to ensure a broader group of voices in our development of the plan. When we developed that plan, we shared it with PICA and council and the controller and posted it online. As with early versions of the plan, the administration's approach focused on using the most up-to-date information about actual spending and residents' needs, minimizing the impact on people of color, maintaining fiscal stability to be able to meet Philadelphia's needs into the future. As this is a contingency plan, we also took strategies that did not need to be implemented on July 1st to achieve the desired savings, allowing us to continue to monitor revenues, spending, and federal relief before making changes. We used updated data regarding collections and spending in FY20 and looked at how that would impact our FY21 starting balance. Doing that, we identified $18 million in unspent reserves and about $28 million in unspent debt service costs that was achieved through better than planned interest rates and savings from refundings that had not been initially budgeted. Assumptions about future debt service costs were also updated. As has been going on since the CARES Act was implemented, the guidance from the feds continues to evolve, and newer guidance shows that we can apply some transaction costs from a cash flow borrowing to the CARES Act, so we will plan to do that. We also identified planned reserves that could be reduced. As we testified during the budget process, even though the current situation is more challenging than we've experienced in decades, remained essential to set aside reserve in case things got worse. Tapping into those reserves as a part of a contingency plan if things get worse, it makes sense. Under the contingency plan, the recession and reopening reserves are reduced entirely in 21 and partially in 22 and 23. The labor reserve for FY21 was also removed. As we did in the initial revisions of budget and plan, we identified opportunities to shift costs to grants or other funds. In addition to the debt service costs, the updated federal guidance made it clear that there were some personnel costs for public health and public safety that were currently included in the general fund that could be shifted to recovery grants funds. That would squeeze out other potential uses for the funds, but the administration will prioritize core service delivery if necessary. These strategies will have limited impact on residents or employees. To address the remainder of the potential gap, the administration identified areas where operational needs may be lower than initially envisioned in the May proposal. For example, less demand for police vehicles purchased by the Office of Fleet Management and human resource support in the Chief Administrative Office for onboarding new cadets in light of the decision to reduce headcount in the police department. The contingency plan also would include some difficult decisions, which were made with input from our Budget Equity Committee. The plan provides options for how the city would respond if the risk PICA identifies related to COVID, tax collections, and economic growth materialize. PICA also raised concerns about the low level of fund balance in the plan compared to recent years and best practices. Current conditions cause us to balance projecting lower fund balances against the need to provide services to Philadelphians when they need the most, as Harvey talked about. Lower fund balances are a result of the situation we are in due to COVID. We're able to close about 1/3 of the initial gap closed by COVID by drawing down on reserves built up over the years. In addition to having small but positive fund balances, the plan maintains a reduced recession and reopening reserve, a labor reserve, and a deposit into the rainy day fund, but not until FY25, where we build back up fund balances by the end of the plan, but only to near the low end of the city's internal goal of 6 to 8% of expenditure. PICA, as Harvey discussed, also highlights the city's overtime spending as a risk. We share PICA's concern that overtime be used appropriately, but overtime cannot be looked at in isolation. It's one of the resources the city uses to deliver services. It can be deployed by managers to deliver services to residents more efficiently than other options, like hiring new staff, which means not only additional salaries, but also benefits or contracting out service delivery. To ensure that the city is appropriately using and accurately projecting those costs and that overtime is used strategically, the city will be developing an overtime action plan this fall. We'll make that report available to council and the public as well as to PICA. The last key risk that PICA cites is a long-standing one, the city's pension liabilities. The city has maintained its pre-COVID approach to addressing pension funding. We've maintained the revenue recognition policy, and the use of that funding approach led Pew to conclude that even if earnings are lower than the assumed rate of return, the pension fund will continue on its road to full funding. The risks that PICA outlines are real. Some are long-standing, and some are based on the unique impacts of COVID-19. A plan that eliminated those risks would require spending reduction on a significantly more draconian scale, adding the certainty of depriving Philadelphians when we all, and particularly people of color, are more vulnerable than in the past. The plan approved unanimously at PICA balances risks in the future against today's needs. We were pleased to say that we're on track to meet or exceed our FY20 revenue projections, including for the BERT, that were incorporated into the 5-year plan approved by PICA. We obviously are not in the clear. While it's the standard work of the administration, leadership, department management, the budget office, and PICA, and council to monitor revenues and spending continually throughout the year, and course correction is necessary, this year will require more diligence given how slim the margins may be and the ever-present changes and shifts due to COVID. This will include adding monthly spending reports available publicly, in addition to the current monthly revenue reports and continuation of quarterly reports that track spending, revenues, and performance for the past quarter and year to date, along with providing quarterly updates to year-end targets and projections based on actual experience. Like most cities and states and nations around the world, Philadelphia faces risks in the coming months as we strive to meet the needs of vulnerable Philadelphians made more vulnerable due to this public health and economic crisis, all while facing our own operational and fiscal constraints. We're responding to new, unanticipated, long-term challenges, and within this context, taking all the opportunities to increase equity and opportunity for all Philadelphians. The 5-year plan was developed to move us forward together through the difficult time. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and we look forward to continuing to work with all members of council on maintaining fiscal stability and supporting Philadelphians in this tumultuous time. We're happy to take any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. Excellent. I do have a few questions, and I'll turn it over to my colleagues. I know I asked Director Rice the date of their consulting when they thought a vaccine might occur, and I think he mentioned July 1st. Do you know the date of what the city's consultant thought it might occur?
I'm gonna let Marissa answer that when she unfreezes. I'll start to answer it, and then if she gets back.
Hi, and I apologize. I turned the internet. Can you hear me? If I leave the camera off, my internet's funky.
Yeah, we can hear you. It's good.
Great. So IHS, who are the consultants that the city uses for our revenue projections, didn't take a binary approach to economy opened or closed or pinpoint a specific date for reopening. What they did do is look at incremental improvement over the course of our 5-year plan. We've sort of been referring to this as a Nike swoosh of a recovery, so incremental improvement, not a date where we're 100% open. Part of that was also informed by analysis by the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission that had done some looking into what percentage of our economy has been open or closed during different phases. So even during the red phase, more than 50% of businesses fell into the essential and operating category. And we also then matched that with looking at various sector by sector. So one of the things that, is really apparent if you're looking around at the economy is that tourism, hospitality, restaurants are particularly hard hit. And that's really true and felt in our communities, but they're actually a very small part of our BERT collections. And so when we were looking at those projections, we were really trying to match up what sectors make up a particularly healthy chunk of our normal collections and where they were. And so, for example, construction, which reopened fairly early, is one of our larger sectors, or some of our largest sectors in terms of BERT payments are in professional services to remote work fairly quickly compared to some others. So that was the sort of information we were using, but we weren't pinpointing then a particular date as a binary open or closed economy.
Could you tell me right now, today, what percentage you think of the Philadelphia economy is actually functioning versus what percentage is not?
What I can tell you is that DVRPC found that I think it was about 54% was open during red, and in the yellowish phase that went up to the upper 50s. And we can share that study and get more of the details, because what they did was industry by industry identify those sectors.
Yeah, I would like to, maybe you can share with this committee, I'll share with my colleagues the percentages of what industries are open, what percentage are in really bad shape. And then the question becomes, what can we do to help support those that really need our help?
Yeah.
The second question I have is on the staffing chart that PICA showed. I just want to clarify something. I'm not sure this is accurate. PICA showed a report that we currently have 22,325 staffing the city. And it shows that in this next budget, it's increasing to 23,980, which is like hiring 1,600 plus new people. Is that accurate?
It's not. So what the full-time position chart in the budget shows is the highest position number that each department could get to in the year with their budget allocation. They don't actually ever get to that number, and they definitely don't get to them at the same time. So, for example, last year's adopted budget had 23,779 employees, but at the November increment run, we were only at 22,325. So there's always a big gap between what this table shows and what's actually ever going to be on board. And if you look at the budget detail that the council receives, you'll also see that one of the things we build in each department is what we call a vacancy allowance, because we know positions won't be filled. So the amount that's allocated to those departments wouldn't fund these positions for a full year because they're not going to be on board.
So you didn't fund any of these positions that we're looking at these 1,600, or they're not funded in the budget?
They're not funded, right, that's right.
Would it make sense just to change the number then?
Well, we've done that in some years. There's no great way to show this because you're really comparing a point in time, which is the increment run, versus a full year number. I mean, I guess we could in the future try to project what the number will be on the increment run in the following year, right, and show that, and then that would be a much smaller number.
Okay, that was my next question for you. Management of overtime, you heard it earlier on this in this hearing, has been an issue for a very long time. And we heard in the PICA director's testimony, and you heard a lot in our council hearings, and a lot from my colleagues on council. So with an increase of, it looks like roughly 200 plus employees in this year's budget, we should hopefully see your staff replacement factor needs maybe decrease a bit, and depending on retirements, but what's the administration prepared to do in order to get overtime spending to budgeted levels throughout the year? And could you be specific in departmental activities this year? And we'd like to have that background if that's possible.
Sure. Do you want me to?
Yeah.
So I think in terms of the overall class 100 and the share then that the overtime makes up, because as Rob was saying, unfilled positions at a certain time might mean that there's more overtime in that period. And so what we're doing is looking department by department, and we'll be working for an overtime action plan that we'll deliver to PICA in the fall that really does a deep dive into each department, looking at their historical trends in terms of both exceeding not only their overtime budget, but overtime and class 100, because part of this, as Harvey mentioned, and as you mentioned, is around, are we projecting correctly? And then the other is then, is that in fact the right level? And so understanding that mix of both overtime as well as the entire class 100 is what we are going to be looking at. And, PICA has definitely identified some individual departments that have had, exceeded their overtime, some historically on that list, some were new, particularly in the last quarter, that were departments that, historically never had overtime. So all of a sudden commerce did, but that's because they had flipped into emergency mode to stand up the business relief program. So we want to understand particularly a longer historical time view as opposed to just FY20, which has some serious anomalies. And that's why we'll do that deep dive into historical data, identify which departments may need an action plan and which ones, the mix is right. And that way we'll figure out which departments to really focus on.
Okay. Just a follow up to that. I think it was noted in your testimony that there will be plans in place by this fall. But by this fall, we're already through the first quarter of the fiscal year. Where are these controls and plans in place with our departments? And are they, how do we control driving the lion's share of this overtime cost to control it?
So in terms of, at that point being a quarter in and what we're doing, that's in part why PICA has requested these monthly spending reports. So we'll be able to detect any anomalies. Also, the budget office regularly does payroll projections. And so anytime that, if any vacant positions are looking to be filled, we do a payroll projection that basically says if we took now as a snapshot in time and projected forward, where are they going to wind up by the end of the year? Are they headed, to stay on track or off track? And so we're regularly able to look at their progress so far in the year in terms of their class 100 spending and figuring out if they have any additional room. And so that is part of the ongoing communication the budget office has with departments on a regular basis, basically, as they're making those transactions.
Last question, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues. We're all interested, everyone, in advancing measurable goals on council and administration. A lot of the work has gone into the poverty action. And as I said to Director Rice, we're interested in how we can close this gap of specifically 55% of Philadelphians who are people of color, and then 1 in 4 Philadelphians living in poverty. Can you talk about the administration's overarching goals that were part of this budget for the city and how our spending on programs and strategies, even in this environment, will help us get there? And where is all this being measured and monitored?
So what I would start with is when we unfortunately, for the May 1st version of the budget had to figure out what we were going to do. We also were really thoughtful about what we were going to preserve and what needed to continue to be funded. And so one of the areas that we realized was really core to Philadelphia's survival today and in the future was maintaining our commitments in education. And so the version of the budget that council approved continued to really increase our efforts. And so, for example, we increased our contribution to CCP and provided funding for a new scholarship program that is really focused on speeding the time to graduation, increasing the graduation rate, and reducing racial disparities in terms of those various metrics. And so we have our Office of Children and Families, and within the mayor's office are looking at those in partnership between the administration and CCP, because we understand that intergenerational poverty is going to involve some long-term investments. And so we're really taking an ongoing commitment to things like pre-K to make sure kids get a really good start, and we were maintaining our level of funding and number of seats, not the expansion that we had planned, but at least maintaining. We continued our commitment to increase funding to the school district. And so while not the $45 million increase we had initially wanted, still a $30 million increase. And when you look at sort of the local tax effort towards education, that's really where a lot of the city's money is. Council Member Parker pointed out that the pie chart from PICA, when it looked at education, it didn't give the full picture. And so when you look at everything and say, okay, between the taxes that go directly to the school district, as well as the contribution from the city to the school district, to CCP, for the work ready, for pre-K, for community schools, all together in FY21, that's going to be which is an increase that of about $400 million from where we were in FY17. And so when you talk about where the city's budget has grown in recent years, really it's two primary areas: addressing that long-standing pension problem that PICA and many others have spoken to, and making those investments in education. And so there's other pillars and aspects to our investments in addressing poverty. Looking at the work around affordable housing and other areas, as well as in workforce development. But education has been where we put a lot of commitment to maintain, even as we had to make really difficult decisions elsewhere in the budget. We think that is what will get us through and continue us on a path for a really thriving, equitable, inclusive Philadelphia.
Okay, thank you. Just want to make a comment. Is it possible that council can get a copy of the monthly reports that'll be submitted to PICA, of the revenue and expenses, and give us the monthly margins?
Yes. Yep. You'll definitely make sure.
Yep.
I'd like to open it up to my colleagues, and I think Majority Leader Parker has a question.
Thank you, Chairman. I wanted to ask you, Rob and Marissa, and I don't know that you will necessarily have the answers. I just want you to help me understand how this occurs and how you sort of monitor the market. Ever since, firms were allowing people to work from home, particularly those who work in Philadelphia but live in the suburbs, people, were not required to pay the non-resident wage tax, and or, they could, in essence, apply for a refund. With that being said, when I think about Center City and all of the firms who lease office space, they lease office space there. Are we seeing any kind of downturn? Has the industry said that because firms have been able to function with their employees working from home, maybe they don't need to use as much space, and they're not interested in renewing leases? Because I'm concerned about the impact that would have on our revenue generating facility. And the reason why I ask is because I've heard of two firms in particular with space in Center City, and they've said, listen, our lease is going to expire, I don't know, maybe the next quarter or two, next 2 quarters, and they don't plan to renew. So how is it revenue that's having conversations with that industry to monitor in real time what that space is like? Or, how does that occur? Are there like monthly meetings, particularly now? What happens there?
Yeah, I think that's really more commerce and planning and development would be the agencies that would be in communication with those firms to kind of understand their plans and to and talk those through with them. Revenue and then to some extent OPA kind of see it on the back end, whereas commerce and planning and development would see it on the front end.
I would recommend Rob and Marissa, and again, that's only 2 firms that I'm thinking about that I know have said, listen, after the next 2 quarters, we're not going to renew our lease. I want to request the administration have some conversation with the Commerce Department, along with Council Chairman Dom, along with Council President Clark and our tech staff and Appropriations Chair Quinones Sanchez, so that as we are sort of trying to get a real-time snapshot of our revenue projecting capacity, generating capacity for the future, that we're taking that into consideration and we're getting some updates in real time.
That makes a lot of sense. Ooh, thanks.
And finally, I wanted to ask you, by now has revenue seen, and this is what had me really concerned. Once we knew that residents outside of the city did not, who worked here, who were working from home, did not have to pay that non-resident wage tax. And even during the budget conversations, we talked about that, administration along with council consistently. Have you all been communicating, obviously, in real time with revenue, and what kind of impact would you say, or have we even seen it, or has not enough time going by for us to be able to determine what that reduction looks like?
Yeah, so we get regular updates from revenue. They monitor it on a daily basis. We did make projections about what would happen to the wage tax, and kind of what's happened there has been pretty similar to what we projected. But I think maybe Marissa can give more details on that.
Sure. So part of the process for folks seeking who are going to want to stop paying that, we anticipate will come through refund applications. That right now, in the midst of everything, folks are, their employers still withholding how they were pre-COVID, and that this will come on the back end. And so we haven't gotten word from the Revenue Department yet that there's been any spike in those refund applications, but it'll probably be a little while before we even begin to see those. At that point, some folks are going to, make a decision: is it even worth it to them, to go through the process of filling out the application, and maybe they'll bring in an accountant. And so, if this is just a short-term thing for them, they may even not opt to do that, and that could help us a bit. But when we built our wage tax projections, we did take into account that not only might some of this be temporary, but some might be permanent, and that folks may permanently work outside of the city. And so when we looked at the projections from IHS about how we should be reducing our wage tax, we then went another 30% deeper to account for those changes for those commuters who might not come back. That said, though, it is just an ever-evolving situation. There was a real initial burst of productivity despite remote work, but I was just, anecdotally reading a Wall Street Journal article yesterday that that's beginning to slow down, as one, folks aren't as panicked as they were, the sort of fear-based productivity in the beginning when they were really concerned about job loss, and that two, that businesses are now beginning to see some challenges with onboarding new employees, younger employees not getting to learn by being side by side from more experienced staff. And so a lot of when PICA held that convening in conjunction with the Federal Reserve with a lot of those economists, one of the things they were saying was that it is likely that we might see a hybrid as things come back. You know, folks are in the office sometime, out of the office sometime. And one of the things that is a real factor for us in terms of those non-resident wage taxes is whether or not working remotely and working outside the city is for the employee's convenience or is required by the employer. And so if the employer says you must, stay at home, there is no office for you to come back to the way you. But if instead it says you have the option of working remotely a couple days a week and you figure that out, the wage tax is in fact still due. These are going to present some real sort of auditing and tax administration challenges that we haven't had before, but they're not entirely dissimilar to our past efforts around auditing the wage tax. So we'll see how it unfolds, but a lot of it is going to depend on whether or not businesses are requiring those employees to stay outside as opposed to just giving that option.
Got it. Well, thank you for that response, Chris. You would really have revenue keep council updated on whether or not we do see a spike, right, in those applications, because that is something we would need to know immediately, and that will help us in our deliberations in the future. In addition to that, I wanted to note for the record that the report that I was reviewing, it was the real estate section of Evercore ISI, and I'm looking at their Q2 office quarterly, and they're noting that demand falls to lowest level since 2009, while new supply, and they're talking about office space, it gets delayed but not canceled. So I want to see the city of Philadelphia paying very close attention to what is happening relative to office space in Center City in particular, so that we will know how it will impact us financially. Thanks so much for your testimony.
Thank you, Majority Leader Parker. I want to just add on, I think you have a very valid point about the office sector. I think there's many office people right now that are actually condensing their space, going from big space into smaller space. But I think the biggest issue isn't just the office, it's also the retail. And it's not just large, it's small businesses too, and the amount of bankruptcy we're seeing across the board here for many stores in the retail sector that are filing bankruptcy that are in Philadelphia and are all over the country. I mean, the list is pretty long when you actually see who's filing bankruptcy right now. So I think what we need to focus on is how we bring the lifestyle back on all neighborhoods and how we help these businesses survive. And because people want to live in urban environments because of that lifestyle and the convenience. And so whatever we can do to create that lifestyle, we'll get the people back from the office buildings, because the office buildings were there because the talent wanted to be in the city. We need to create that lifestyle back as soon as we can. Anyway, I'll stop speaking about that, and let's go to Councilmember Maria Quinones-Sanchez. She has a question.
Thank you, and I want to reemphasize what Councilmember Parker mentioned about the ability to monitor and look at that flex space. I also think folks looking to either downsize in Center City, particularly in the hospitality industry, presents an opportunity for us to offer neighborhoods as options as people will need additional spaces, right? So your quaint restaurant in downtown with a $10,000 rent can move to Mount Airy or South Kensington and others and have more space and opportunity. And so how do we get in front of that so that people, to your point, who come into the city because of the vitality of the city, how do we create that? I think in the new normal, it's going to get recreated, but it also presents an opportunity for the neighborhoods adjacent to Center City and beyond. So, crisis creates opportunities, and we have to get ahead of that. So anything we can do, and again, in this regard, following the administration's lead on that, I know all district council people are really much interested in this. I had a couple of questions related to, you heard from earlier, Rob and Marissa. Do you have a very succinct response to the issue of the additional staffing patterns for the city of Philadelphia. We've made a commitment to public safety around, staffing up police and fire and others. What of that growth pattern from 20 to 21 do we absolutely really need, and its impact on the basic services people want, and how much of that stuff can really be rolled back? Do you have an initial response to that?
Yeah, so kind of follow up with what we're talking about with Councilman Dom. We won't be getting up to that number. The number that shows there, we won't reach that. We won't come close to that. There's a lot of those positions that have budgeting for a portion of the year. As you know, we put in that vacancy allowance, so we don't have funding for the full year for positions. So the short answer is we're not going to get there. The largest single increase that we show is for the fire department, uniform employees for fire, and that really is part of what's been a multi-year process to try to restore some of the cuts that we made back in 2008, 2009. So I don't know whether you wanted to add anything to that, Marissa?
I just would also add that some of those are not, in fact, new staff coming on, but a decision to shift staff from the capital budget to the general fund. It is not a great practice for us to use borrowed money that we pay interest on over the next 20 or plus years for salaries that get paid out today. And so some of the position counts that you're seeing moving to the general fund are people who are currently on staff working on capital projects, but we wanted to continue our efforts to not borrow money to pay their salaries, but pay it out of our day-to-day resources. And so some of that staff count, particularly if you see that in the Department of Public Property, is what's happening there. So it's not bringing on new staff to expand services, but shifting how we pay.
Well, that's an important piece. As someone who has really looked at this bad practice that the water department and others departments have around that, I think that's hugely important. But then highlighting that and calling it out is important, because I think, again, people are going to agree with us or disagree with us, but having that context is hugely important. I am for, and I'm still beside myself that the water department is saying it's going to take them 10 years to move their operational staff from their capital budget to operations. But nevertheless, as we move forward, I think that is the right way to go, and explaining that, I think it's important. I want to go to the issue of your contingency budget, because I think the contingency budget, and I appreciate the fact that PICA requested that, given what we know today, poverty, I appreciate Chairman Dom speaking to that, there's nothing in that contingency that I see as urgent. Like, I'd like to see us really look at, this racial equity lens that we're looking at and saying some of that contingency stuff we shouldn't be doing anyway, and we really should be investing in people. Who right now makes up that think box of that racial equity lens right now, as these decisions are being made, both from a financial and a programmatic? Who's the who?
So part of what we did, particularly in the last two, each time, the contingency plan and the round of reductions before that, was the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion pulled together a budget equity committee that includes cabinet members like Cynthia Figueroa and Ann Fedulin, lower level staffers, though, to get some different positions. So not at that cabinet level, not even at the commissioner level. So I think about Mike Keisha from the mayor's office, also Tumor Alexander. And we can get you a full list of who participated. I'd just be doing that off the top of my head. But what we wanted to do was to bring a diversity of viewpoints. We also, this budget season, and we talked about this when we initially came for the first round of budget hearings, about introducing that racial equity lens. And so as we were asking departments, what they would, if we were to invest more, what we'd invest in, and if we had to reduce, what we would reduce, and making sure that there were questions embedded in that about the impact on vulnerable populations and people of color. So we really began asking everyone to take that mindset. So have that be the lens through which they were making these pitches. Also this year, as we moved through the budget office, budget process, we were trying to get more and more impact input. So our Office of Civic Engagement and Volunteer Services, what they did was pull together representatives from a number of the city's boards and commissions and use them as an opportunity to gather input and as a sounding board as these decisions were being made, as well as we also did a survey in which we got about 30,000 flyers out in the free food distribution boxes that have been going out, as well as whenever folks called into 311 to ask them, what do you need? Was really the core question. And so that was the lens through which we were beginning to make some of these decisions using the data and sort of qualitative input we were able to get from our boards and representatives directly from folks, particularly the folks who were, requesting services from us right now. And so that's what we were presenting in our larger conversations.
So council started a work group that council member Catherine Gilmore Richardson and council member Isaiah Thomas around the disparity issues. I don't know why the administration continues to resist having a task force as other cities have to really look at this equity lens, but it pains me to sit through the hearing that we sat this morning and, that we highlight it, we talk about it, and that we're really not being as focused and intentional on it. My hope is that in that process that council is going to go through and having conversations with our constituents, the people who pay our salaries, the people who want to hold us accountable, that the administration will be a little bit more open to some of the recommendations we're going to hear, again, around how do we get to that. When you say equity and inclusion without the recognition of the historical disparities and racial disparities, it's hard because, saying, inclusion and equity now without filling in what has historically been disinvestment is being disingenuous, and I like to get to that space. I know that in this recovery phase, we're going to be asking everybody to do more with less, but I just feel it's hard to ask others to do what we haven't introspectively done with ourselves. And again, I'm going to come back to this Kensington issue where the money will be spent around public safety and the reactionary mode, and we can't get $500,000 to just restore people's quality of life that we destroyed. I really don't think we're listening. I don't think we've listened to the protesters. I know what we say and it feels good, but words mean nothing if they don't get backed up with actions. And again, I know that we want to be very careful in how we make investments. But I looked at those contingency line items, and I don't know how I face Kensington and tell them we can't spend $500,000 in them, but you have a contingency budget around cars and other things. It as an elected leader, shame on us that we can't figure something out better for this. So a task force that really looks at an equity lens with a table of folks that can hold us accountable to that is huge. And council should not be the only person at that table. But I'm very concerned that, again, those people making those calls, whether they're mid-level or other staff members, are being cautious in their approach when we need to be deliberate and intentional. So I feel still very, very uncomfortable as the decisions we're making, the discretion we have with the CARES Act money, and whatever the new version of this federal allocation is going to be. I don't see us doing what we're saying. And unless you can tell me otherwise, I don't know why $500,000 in restoration of Kensington versus cars or some of these line items is not more important. I don't know what to tell Kensington folks. I'm beside myself around what we have there. You guys turned down everything in the Restore Kensington plan, everything. And you said it's all based on funding. But then I see this contingency budget and an overtime budget. And there's no consistency there in what you're saying.
Is there any response to Councilmember Fiona Sanchez's comments?
So just to be clear, these are all things that we're taking out, right? So these are all things that we would cut to make sure that we didn't go negative. None of this is investment that we're making.
No, you're making a decision that's where you're going to put your money right now. And I'm saying I have a crisis. I've had a pandemic crisis in Kensington before the pandemic. And Council Member Zuella and I worked with our stakeholders and came up with a plan that was about $500,000 to restore what we broke in Kensington, and we were told that this administration did not have it. And then I look at a contingency plan of this is stuff we can cut if our projections are lower, and it's cars. How do we reconcile that?
So I thought, and I didn't see the final back and forth in Kensington, but I thought where we were was that there were portions of the plan that we were going to do, some portions that we said were things we couldn't pay for now, and some things where we said they required extra budgetary resources and we were going to look for those. I thought that was the combination of the response.
No. I'm sincerely asking you guys to revisit this.
Okay, well, let us revisit, because that's where I thought we were, and if that's not where we were, then we should revisit it.
That's not where we are at all.
Okay, then we will revisit it.
Again, folks in Kensington will see this contingency budget and say cars are more important than quality of life, than trauma, than trash, than all of the other things that are going on. And I just, it's very hard to reconcile. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to take up any more of your time, but I just want folks that as we work through, and I appreciate as we appropriate and we use our discretion around what is COVID related, how we respond to the pandemic, that folks understand that people are more important than cars. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilperson Fiona Sanchez. And let me just mention something to Rob and Marissa. When we had a budget committee, and it was Council President Clark, Councilmember Green, Councilmember Fiona Sanchez, Councilmember Parker, myself, I know I'm missing somebody. I don't know. There was 6 of us. And we asked the administration for alternatives to the budget. And we were told there was no other alternatives, 0. But yet when PICA asked for the alternatives, you found $90 million. So I guess my question is, going forward, I don't want to go back, going forward, I would appreciate, and I think the committee would appreciate it, if we were privy to that information just going forward, because I think that's kind of what Councilmember Fiona Sanchez is talking about. Like, if you could find $90 million for PICA, could you find $500,000 for Kensington?
Yeah, and I think what we said during the process, and we say this in our testimony, is that we wanted to maintain some reserves in case things got worse. And what we're saying to PICA is we have some reserves in case things got worse. And in terms of where this leaves us with fund balances, it's really low. This is not where we want to be.
Right.
And I think that's consistent with what we said to you folks during the hearing process. I think the other thing that's happened is there's now another month of information, right? So some of these things, like the CARES Act guidance, had changed. Like a month ago, we didn't know that we could apply cash flow borrowings to CARES Act money. So that's something new. So we're able to do that now. There's some things with expenditures that we don't know till the year is over. So we're looking at that now and realizing we're in slightly better shape. We're also, really concerned back then about where taxes were going to wind up, because we had just had a month, as Councilman Green said when he was talking to Mr. Rice, where our revenues are coming a lot lower than we thought. So we were really nervous about what's going to happen with the BERT. We are in a better place now because BERT actually came in where we thought it was going to. So, things have changed a lot in a month. And one of the things about life in COVID world is things move a lot faster than they used to. So, what was true at the end of June is not true at the end of July anymore, and probably won't be true at the end of August, which is why it's so important that we do these monthly reports on expenditures and revenues and see how they line up against our projections.
All right, that's a good response, Rob. I'll accept that. And by the way, I just want to clarify, on the committee was Councilmember Parker, Council President Clark put it together, Councilmember Green, Councilmember Cameron Sanchez, Councilmember Zuella, and myself. I thought that was a great committee. Just for the record, I'll put that together.
Yeah, I thought it was helpful for us too.
Yeah. So I know Councilmember Derek Green has questions, so I'd like to recognize him.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Rob and Marissa, for your testimony for today. And I'm just following up and wanted to reflect on some of the conversation that Councilmember Sanchez made, and also reflecting on the budget process. And you know, I've been very involved through my work as a member of the Board of National Cities, and we've had very frequent emails and conversations regarding the possibility of revenue reimbursement. You know, we have been pushing this Cities Are Essential campaign because we know it's so important, not only for Philadelphia, but also my other hat as First Vice President for the Pennsylvania Municipal League, important for cities around the Commonwealth and around the nation. And so if we do receive some dollars coming out of a new CARES legislation, and considering that our fund balance FY21 and 22 is about $50 million, but we also have these issues that were highlighted by Councilmember Sanchez in reference to wildlife investments. I want to get a perspective of the thinking going forward on how the administration will make these decisions. I think people, and I can't speak for members of council, but there's a general sense that the budget that was presented, the revised budget, did not include input from the legislative branch per se, or others. And so there had to be this conversation, negotiation. But going forward, now that we know some more information or more data, as you said, in reference to the numbers coming in, but we also know that we're going to have a low fund balance. We also have a concern that looking at the PICA estimates versus the city estimates, we may not make the projections that we anticipate, so revenues may be lesser going forward because of COVID-19. How will the administration work with council going forward, coming out of what came out of the budget process, especially if things are going to have to go through an appropriations committee, and when you hear the concerns that Councilmember Sanchez raised, other council members have raised about this equity lens? Will there be a more inclusive process as we look at potential dollars when we're trying to balance between revenues possibly not being where they were, trying to make up for lost revenues because of COVID-19, but also needing to make investments from a racial equity lens from a wildlife concerns that we have going forward?
Yeah. So, yes, and one of the issues that we had in the budget process this year is the speed with which we had to change the budget. We had very little time, so it wasn't a normal type of process, and didn't allow us to have as much involvement as we would have liked. So we will involve council more if there is additional CARES Act funding. We have put council representation on the steering committee for our recovery committee. So that's one way in which we'll make sure that that the council's involved. We'll also have to see what comes out. So in the thing the Republicans did yesterday, they put some constraints on. They said you can use the recovery money through the end of September, which is good. That gives us more time. And they said, well, you could use it for revenue replacement, but then there's a provision that says only if a quarter of what you got goes to other governments, which I think is designed for for states, but then, kind of handicaps us in what we can do. They also said none of that money can go to build up a rainy day fund or to go to pensions. So I think what's really important during the next stage is to make sure that, however that money comes out, it doesn't have restrictions that mean that we can't use it in ways that we think are best for the city.
And just to follow along that thought process, and you're talking about collaborative process, as opposed to waiting to hear what the end results may be. And, the council president talked about we'll more likely have a budget 2 process. It may be helpful to start having those conversations about knowing we don't know what that amount may be, but what are some of the general priorities for the administration if we have additional dollars and where those investments may be. Not holding the administration to specific number amounts, but categories of putting categories the administration would like to fund, and how do we start to bring that conversation along with some of the aspects from members of the council of trying to deal with some of the racial equity issues we're talking about, as well as trying to restore some of the dollars that were lost due to COVID-19. But I think it makes sense if we can at least start having a conversation regarding the broader topics, so that way as we're starting to get an idea of what those dollars may or may not be, we at least have an understanding where people are coming from, and we can get hopefully closer together in a collaborative way sooner than later.
And would that be maybe working with the budget group that Councilman Dom set up, or council leadership? How would you want us to do that?
That's
happy to.
I mean, that's not for me to say. That I just made that as a suggestion. Those are multiple options, but I think that starts the process.
Yeah, and I saw the council president on the screen, so it was kind of geared towards him too.
Great timing. Great timing.
Thank you, Councilmember Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And also, Rob, just to clarify, it's Council President Clark organized that committee. You did a good job. And I want to recognize.
Yeah, no, you mentioned it. I wasn't saying that you put it together. You had just mentioned it.
Oh, just one piece.
Yeah.
Council President, good afternoon.
I think you're muted.
Yeah.
Council President.
Yeah, sorry about that. Been jumping on and off. Had some pressing issues that I'm trying to multitask. But good conversation. So, are you calling on me, sir?
I see your hands raised.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, sir. I'm not used to being on this side of the equation. First of all, thank you, Mr. Chair. And then, how's everybody doing? Rob, real quick, I just wanted to ask you one question. I was actually interested in your response to Councilman Green, because it's not looking good with the Republican plan that was unveiled yesterday, but I understand that there will be a process once it gets to the House, and actually has to get by the Senate side. I think it's a 60 vote requirement on this one, so you might be in pretty good shape. One of the things I want to ask you on a local level, because we can only control what we can control. So the Chamber of Commerce, and I don't know if this question came up, is supposed to be rolling out their initiative to kind of start the economy. And I know we have one representative on that committee, John Christmas, and I believe you all have the Commerce Director on that. And they're supposed to unveil these early action items that are supposed to be within our ability, i.e. the city or the region, and moving quickly. How engaged are you all from the fiscal side of that, the possibilities of bringing back some additional revenue beyond what we project? Because that's what they're looking at. They were basically saying outside of the city's budget process, if they were in a position to tee up some additional opportunities for more revenue that would ultimately flow to the city, i.e. taxes. Are you guys very engaged, or just kind of waiting to see what happens?
So I know Commerce has been engaged. We in Finance have not been directly engaged.
All right. Can you, because that's
that's
significant. I understand everybody tries to stay in their lane. But if there's some realistic opportunities there, I know they're going to be looking at possibilities of, for lack of a better term, stealing some business from other cities. And I know short term it may not be in a position, but in terms of your 5-year plan, it could conceivably be beneficial if there's the likelihood that we'll be able to put some things in play. But they are going to unveil something short term that I think they're hiring up sooner than later.
Okay, we'll check in with Commerce.
Thank you. I'm good, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Council President.
Doing a great job, sir.
Thank you. Good seeing you. Thank you. Okay, listen, Marissa and Bob, thank you for your testimony. We appreciate it. Look forward to working with both of you as things progress. And Ms. Gerbeck, can we please call the third panel of witnesses?
We have Tom Ginsberg, Alexandria Zhang, and Justin Edwards.
Mr. Ginsberg, you want to proceed with your testimony?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for this opportunity. I am Tom Ginsberg of the Pew Charitable Trust Philadelphia, Research and Policy Initiative. Pew conducts and researches and engages with officials both at the local and state level on fiscal issues. I will talk about the local level, and then I will hand off to my colleague, Alex Zhang, who will talk about the state level perspective. I'll start by saying that Pew's research is strictly nonpartisan, independent, and data-driven. One of the things we're seeing at the city government level is that budgeting difficulties have only just begun, and that is something local officials are now confronting. Earlier this month, we gathered current and former budget officials from Philadelphia, Houston, San Francisco, and Detroit on a webinar to talk about budgeting during a crisis. These cities all recently just finished their budgets, or in the case of San Francisco, is still finishing it. All of them, to varying degrees, took money out of their reserves or their rainy day funds. That was a crucial option for all of them, but it is one that may be hard to do next year in the future to the same extent, notwithstanding federal aid. Each city expects it will have to formally revise this year's revenue projections sooner and maybe more often than usual. San Francisco's controller even joked that his office has a pool going on exactly how soon that revision will have to be made. To this point, PICA just required Philadelphia to release, as you heard, its revenue and spending snapshots monthly instead of quarterly. This may be the new normal for local government budgeting during this period of reopenings and reclosings and upheaval in the work and business patterns affecting the tax base. Another point they made is the necessity now for policymakers to broaden, to the extent they can, from immediate term and one-time actions to actions that are built on longer-term planning and recurring revenues. This means taking into account expected changes in the tax base 1, 2, and more years down the road. Difficult, but necessary. One of our panelists, John Hill, a former Detroit CFO, emphasized one way to do this in a time of extreme uncertainty is greater use of scenarios and scenario planning. Those may consider a variety of social and public health trends in addition to economic factors over longer periods. These can give policymakers additional information to make decisions about trade-offs between expenditures. In some cities, scenarios and budget options already are a part of the regular planning and input process. To some extent, Philadelphia has done that. New York City has an independent budget office, and it goes even further, and it regularly publishes a list of budget options for revising programs, eliminating tax breaks, a variety of things, in addition to estimates of savings and revenue potential. This crisis is also highlighting something else. The challenge of wide swings in revenue from one year to the next is known as revenue volatility. Our research shows that a jurisdiction's particular mixture of taxes, not just the level of taxes, affects this volatility. And we are seeing some of that now. Cities with relatively high reliance on property taxes are reporting somewhat smaller budget gaps this year, because property tax tends to be less volatile. Those cities with greater reliance on economic or income-based taxes, sales taxes, for example, are facing bigger budget gaps this year, and Philadelphia is in that latter camp. One of the ways that cities and many states have ameliorated revenue volatility is with rainy day funds. It's been discussed here already. Here it's called the Budget Stabilization Reserve. Philadelphia's fund was relatively small, but it was still helpful in the past year, and it had other less restrictive reserves that was able to use. To a large extent, however, these reserves are one-time and limited-time fixes. And as Marissa Waxman told our convening, Philadelphia probably won't be able to dig out another $100 million from the seat cushions again next year to the same extent that it did. I'll also add one point about rainy day funds. It's been a finding of our research that budget crises like the one we're in now, those were often the periods in the past where jurisdictions made changes to their rainy day funds and their reserve rules. And finally, another area of our research has been PICA, which you've heard from them, and you've heard a lot about them. In our research, we've found, looking at other cities, and how they carry out PICA-type functions, they do it in a variety of ways, such as multi-year advanced budgeting, budget scenarios, things like that. And we will be putting out some more research about that, so hopefully soon. At our convening about PICA before the pandemic, local and state officials debated PICA's role, its functions, and its future. Whether the situation today has changed their views, we don't know. But we can say, up until now, we have seen one area of consensus about PICA, and that is the need for city and state policymakers to start engaging now on the question about PICA's future. Thank you very much, and I'll hand off to Alex.
All right, thanks, Tom, and thank you, council members, for this opportunity. My name is Alex Zhang, and I'm with the Pew Charitable Trust State Fiscal Health Project. The fiscal health of states matters locally, as locals' needs and revenues are partly provided by their states. Philadelphia is no exception, although it has more autonomy than many other local governments. Before the pandemic began, most states would have said their budgets were in reasonably good shape. Pennsylvania, however, was not the best among the best of them. While it had built up its rainy day fund, that fund was actually one of the smallest as a percentage of state spending. The Commonwealth also had one of the worst funded public pension systems among all states. Looking at data through 2019, 19 states, including Pennsylvania, were still spending less than they were a decade ago, after deep cuts to areas including higher education and infrastructure. The Commonwealth's latest public estimates showed its total revenues down 8%. Facing uncertainty due to the virus, the state was among 10 states that decided to delay enacting a fiscal year 21 budget, or just to enact short-term plans for now. Even among those that did enact budgets, many expect to make mid-year revisions, like many cities are. For states such as Pennsylvania that entered the recession in a difficult position, and for their local governments, there are no easy answers. But our research does point to fiscal practices both state and local governments can adopt to better deal with the uncertainties ahead. First, as Tom mentioned, governments need projections for how long budget shortfalls might last and how deep they might be. We're now seeing state governments conducting these analyses with scenarios that are tailored to the pandemic, such as modeling revenue based on the length of business closures. Governments also should think through questions such as when reserves should be deployed and what the balance between temporary and permanent changes should be. By taking this long-term perspective informed by scenario planning, states and cities will be more likely to limit the damage of the recession for their residents, budgets, and economies. Those are some of our broad points. Tom and I are happy to try to answer some specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for your testimony. It's very good. I have a few quick questions, and I'll turn over to any questions from my colleagues. First question is, given that many of our nation's cities are in the same situation as us financially, are you aware of any systems, checks and balances, or monitoring structures that other cities are using to determine signs of weakness before things explode into larger issues that we could benefit from? You have to unmute.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, we are looking at some of those questions now. We have some research under the way, and we hope to get it out soon that looks at the way other cities perform a variety of things, long-term planning with their budgets, including budget oversight. Preliminarily, I can tell you that research shows that there's a really wide variety of ways that cities do this, and some do it with more binding authority than others, with oversight functions combined with monitoring and projections. And as we mentioned in the testimony, New York City has probably one of the examples of the most proactive approach, where they actually put out a regular list of options and comparing savings and revenue trends with each one, something like a contingency, I suppose. Others do it in a much less rigorous way. It's hard to say right now where Philly stands among those, but we are looking at it.
Would that be something you could share with this committee also when you have that information?
Absolutely. Hopefully we can when that's out.
Great. I have another question. What can we do to protect our economy here in Philadelphia? Build our revenues. My colleagues have talked about this in this kind of environment. What do we have to do to get our local economy basically back on track? And I'm wondering if you're aware of any economic development activities that have happened in the United States, elsewhere, that might work to protect our business and workers and get us back on track.
I don't think I can answer that question directly in a concrete way. This is an area of ongoing research for us, and we're looking around the rest of the country as council members are too. For examples of what works or not, I think that when you're in an unprecedented situation, people may be trying unprecedented and new things. So we're just keeping an eye on it, just like I'm sure your staff is.
Well, whatever you see that's productive, please let us know if we want to implement.
Absolutely.
Last question. Is there any information yet on how other cities across the country are using the federal dollars that have been dispersed, or any spending plans made in advance for differing revenue scenarios?
Yeah, that is something we are seeing also in our research, and this came up in the hearing today. The federal government has been changing some of its guidelines and its guidance on how the CARES Act money can be used, and maybe in the future with future funds, we don't know yet. We are seeing a variety of approaches. Philadelphia has used its part of its money, as we understand, to close the FY20 budget, and partly for FY21. Other cities have used it in different proportions over those 2 years. They have, we've seen for example, in Houston, that's been fairly aggressive at using the federal money to redeploy some of its city employees into COVID relief activity that could be covered with the CARES money. There is a provision in the guidance that allows for that. We haven't seen other cities do that as much, so that was interesting. Each of these cities, of course, varies quite a bit in the amount of CARES aid money they received, which was population-based. It was distributed based on the size of the population. It was not distributed on the size of the budgets, so that a place that has a very large budget may get proportionally less benefit from that aid than a city with a smaller budget. And there's trade-offs, of course, with local and county budgets. So there are a lot of moving parts to all of this.
Okay. Well, if you have something that is, again, productive, sharing with us, we'd love to see it and see what we could do to benefit from that information. So thank you. I'd like to call upon our Majority Leader, Sherelle Parker, who has a question, and I'm opening up to my colleagues for questions. Majority Leader Parker.
Thank you, Chairman Dom. And Tom and Alex, thank you so much for your testimony. I was able to participate in that webinar. I want to say a special thanks to Pew for hosting it. The question that I'm going to ask, if you have not sort of compiled anything, I would like to make a formal ask, and that if there are any innovative revenue generating mechanisms that you have seen cities across the, and I won't just say our nation, but across the globe employ, from the perspective that, out of crisis comes opportunity. Please make us aware of it, because it is always great to get a fresh set of not just eyes, but just those who have sometimes taken a risk in doing things in a different manner that we may not have thought about. So have you seen any innovative revenue generating mechanisms? I'm
afraid at the moment I can't think of anything in particular that's jumped out. We're spending this immediate period looking at the budgets, and part of that will include looking at different strategies that cities are doing, but we certainly will forward on to you as anybody else, what our findings are.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Majority Leader. I have one other question, maybe Alex or Tom, you could answer. Has anyone used federal dollars for housing projects, affordable housing projects? And I don't even know if this is even allowed.
Is that for me or for Alex?
Either one of you.
I'm not specifically aware of that use of it, and I'm not aware of how much of that is allowed. A lot of localities and states are now going through guidance, as Rob explained. The guidance has been changing. So what activities and what expenditures can they actually bill against CARES has been evolving a little bit, and that might involve housing if it's COVID-related relief. But again, I'm not the final word on that, and we're actually not focused on that part of it with this research.
Okay.
I'm not aware as well, but I'm definitely happy to look into it and follow up.
Oh, that'd be great. That'd be great. And I wanted to thank you both for your testimony today and your patience. It's been a long afternoon, and I appreciate you being here, and thank you again.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
I'd like Ms. Gerbach, please call. Well, actually, we have the social progress imperative is up next, and that would be Justin Edwards. I think you're up next. So, Justin, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Chairperson Dom and members of the council for having me here. I'm very excited to talk to you about and share with you some of the work that we've partnered with some other cities across the country, county governments, and elsewhere in the world on developing what I've heard the term already delivered as an equity screen that has been deployed in budgeting processes all the way through to service development and program development and service allocation. Just briefly to sort of reiterate the testimony that I already sent onwards, a little bit about the Social Progress Index. It was designed to support inclusive growth, which is really a strategic shift in policy making and economic policy setting to ensure that economic progress occurs in greater harmony with societal development in all of its various forms. This index was really redefined. It was developed to redefine how we measure and manage elements that collectively create the success and equity of our societies and communities, and that focus on the real things that matter to everyday people, such as health, education, rights, tolerance, and other things. This was developed in response to a different global financial crisis. We're here again with a different type of global crisis, but this was very much learning from the past 80 years and how ill-equipped we were to look beyond traditional economic variables to identify what were some of those maybe early warning signs that we're heading into some problem territory. We're led by a scientific team, including Professor Michael Porter from Harvard Business School and the Institute for Competitiveness there, Scott Stern at Massachusetts Institute of Technology Sloan School of Management. And we benefit from having a very broad global sort of network of advisors that span economists, national government members, all the way down to municipal government, practitioners, philanthropists, and folks from private sector. I'm going to share a brief set of slides that I hope can illustrate how the index has developed, what it can tell us in terms of increasing the evidence basis to generate new insights on whether or not investments that we're making in communities are moving the needle on things, and where we might learn from success in other parts of our communities where we typically don't look for that success. I'll share my screen here briefly. Quickly, what is social progress? We believe if you're gonna measure something, you got to define it. We define social progress as the capacity for society to meet the very basic needs of its citizens, establish the building blocks on which to allow for a better life that citizens can enhance and sustain at their own direction, and that creates the conditions for all individuals to really reach their full potential. We envision a society in which all people have the conditions necessary to achieve a healthy, sustainable quality of life. Another way of saying that, and equity really is the disappearance of these vast disparities in many of these issues. We're a global nonprofit headquartered in Washington, D.C., with staff around the country and around the globe. And since 2013 have been measuring social progress directly. starting with global index measuring nations on how well they're really converting their economic capacity into a better life for their people. Since then, we've forged partnerships with national, regional governments, including India, the EU Commission, where we've developed a regional index that allocates over 350 billion euros in social cohesion funding, which is like a development fund at the regional, dispersed at the regional level in the EU. We're working with Miami-Dade County in Florida, San Mateo County in California, and cities like Rio de Janeiro, London, and I'll focus a little bit on our work in San Jose, California, as well as Jackson, Mississippi. The index really was developed to complement traditional economic variables like GDP and median household income, but it was developed so that we could develop a picture and answers around those issues that economics don't pick up, like are people sort of healthy, being fed, do they have access to clean water, and do they live in a safe environment? Do people have access to basic education? Can they build an educational foundation? Do they have access and free unfettered access to information communications? Can they keep themselves from getting sick and maintain their health? Do they live in an environment that's already stacking the odds against them because it's so toxic and making them sick? And then in opportunity, this third dimension, we're really measuring these non-economic aspects of opportunity in terms of are people, are their rights being protected as citizens, as individuals? Do they have freedoms to make their own life choices, obviously within the confines of the law, cultural norms? But are they free to pursue their own path in life? Do they feel excluded from the opportunity to be a contributing member of society based on ethnicity or race, by sexual orientation?
Coming to North Philly, I can tell you all about that. How much you pay for that study?
And so very quickly, we measure only social and environmental indicators. We look at outcomes. We don't want to measure inputs. We look at the true lived experience of people. Classic example really is we don't want to measure how much spending has been made on health. We want to look at the health outcomes. What is the obesity rate? What are the diabetes rate? What are the COP-D rates? We designed this framework and measurement methodology to be relevant to all countries. I like to say relevant to all people, obviously driven by context. But it's flexible to be customized at different geographic resolutions, and it's actionable. We can see over time as we start to benchmark and then continue to measure, we can see where these indicators move up and down. We aggregate to a single number. We know that's powerful. When our politicians say that GDP is going to fall by 0.5%, people respond quite quickly to that. We can also set targets. We want to set a growth target economically. We can set a growth target from a social progress as well. So here you have a sample of the global indexes framework, the types of indicators that we're measuring. Each of these three dimensions is equally weighted and then aggregates up to that single number social progress. Each of the four subcomponents within each of the three pillars are also equally weighted, and we use anywhere between 3 to 6 indicators that collectively, both from a context standpoint within the territory we're measuring, but also statistical resonance and relationships show us that they're adding value to the concepts that they're trying to measure. What can this tell us? Because we keep economics out of the model, we can actually look at and examine and interrogate the relationship between social progress and its dimensions and its 12 components against things like poverty rate. We can interrogate the relationship between, what is the relationship between shelter and median household income? Where can we see that an increase in median household income has a significant statistical relationship with the advancement in housing and homelessness reduction? But then where do dollars stop to make as much impact? And where is it policy decisions? Where is it choices? Where is it partnerships and other elements that aren't just simply related to more spending? We've been able to track, globally social progress since 2014. Since 2014, the U.S. has seen a decline, specifically in some particular areas, including inclusiveness, including personal rights, and in health and wellness, and personal safety. These are things that are not strange to us now, because I think we're living this right now. We've lived through it over the past few years, but really the data's starting to pick this up now. We can examine any territory relative to any set of peer cohorts. What we do in the global index, we typically take a country and stand it up next to 15 countries most similar in GDP per capita and understand relative to their economic peers, how well is this country converting its resources into quality of life. You can see the U.S. has a lot of red on its scorecard. I'd be happy to send these slides through so people can look more closely at this and what they are. But you can find this more detailed information with the data and everything on our website. We work in partnership with a lot of different sectors all over the globe. This is just a short map that highlights some of them. We've worked with private sector in South America to develop a lot of regional development studies. We work with regional government through the EU and national government in India and Thailand. I've worked with a number of municipal governments in the U.S., as well as a large Crown Court bank in the province of Alberta to map out social inequity across the province there. What I like to use the words of my partners, not me. I'm not pitching this. I think there's a testimony to how this can actually change the direction of cities in the U.S. We spent about 1.5 years working with Mayor Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi, who's really talking about, at the time he's leading with the idea of building a dignity economy by bringing more people to the table and creating new economic opportunities for those who've historically been left out. How do you identify those people? How do you identify what their particular challenges are from a multidimensional nature of assessing poverty, not just financial poverty, but education poverty, health poverty, opportunity poverty? And then how do you bring in economic and workforce development strategies to engage with people based on the assets that they bring to bear and that can be evidenced, but also really strategically zero in and focus in on those specific needs, community by community. San Jose, last year in October, we launched the first public sort of index here in the United States. It's a partnership with Mayor Liccardo there and all of his city department staff. It's an ongoing process where we worked with the Workforce Development Office, Economic Development Office. We worked with targetedly through the mayor's office, though, where we developed a bespoke index, customizing our framework and the data that we pulled in using a lot of city administrative data. That's looking at their own personal safety data from the police department. We're looking at 311 data to see where are the calls from service coming, where are the more civically engaged places. We leveraged a lot of the data that they've already produced, but really didn't know how to use and make meaningful insight out of. And why this was very important. In his budget message in June 2019, Mayor Liccardo really emphasized the fact that he wanted to break a historic pattern of budgeting based on kind of blunt instrument, throwing a lot of money at a lot of issues in a blanket wide, but instead encouraged his entire city staff to use an equity screen. What does that mean? That means going through a process of using highly customized, contextualized mapping of social data alongside the economic data that they already had on their communities to provide an evidence of great need and prioritize those communities that were most behind. How that has played out now, he's really encouraged, the use of this at the city department, at the city staff level. They did approve the budget. There's a $4.3 billion municipal budget last year. I think their recent budget, the 2021 budget, is still up for grabs, but it's a $4.1 billion budget, and it again follows this process. There was a lot of pushback from several city council members in sort of the traditionally poor part of the city that this may not be speaking to their needs. Fast forward to this year's budget conversations, there's no pushback. There's a lot of sponsorship on this approach. They've seen that by training city staff and department staff to go through the process of using the index, vetting and interrogating the data to provide quantitative evidence of need for programs, they've been able to actually move through a lot of decision making a lot more rapidly and really address some of those specific issues. They're able to pinpoint exactly where some zip codes and also census tracts, when they measure their social progress scores or their dimension scores against their income, they're achieving vastly different levels. Why is that? That's an opportunity for them to investigate all up and down that vertical chain of those neighborhoods. What are the conditions in place in one community where they're converting these resources more effectively than others? And how do we sort of disassociate investing in all of these communities all at once, but looking at where we can target the resources specifically? Again, we can develop a very customized look at relative performance. This is just looking at census tracts. There were 213 census tracts in the city of San Jose. We can look at that and say, let's ring fence around 10 or 15, however it makes sense. In San Mateo County right now, we're working with some folks to expand the cohorts and looking at doing that by racial breakdown and educational attainment rates, the percentage of people unemployed and underemployed, and then another a host of other variables. But we're able, again, to see whether or not this community is trending upwards, if there's a green arrow, if this community is, relatively speaking, performing on average with others, or if it's underperforming. We can also go in and look at some of the raw data, obviously, where it's disaggregated, or we can look at some of the trends based on race, by gender, sometimes even by disability status or by age, if the privacy piece is not in place. There's a lot of opportunity in my experience now, almost 8 years working on this. There's a lot of opportunity to challenge perceptions about what we understand about our communities, both on identifying pockets of need that we didn't know, perhaps were there, and also success stories in places that need to be spotlighted. This neighborhood in Willow Glen, we found within a half-mile apart, two neighborhoods. They diverged in social progress by 166 points. Really, really wild to say that within a 2-minute drive, you could actually be in a completely different city. How the city is using this already, they've already, just in the COVID context, we're talking a lot about CARES money. One of their big issues is closing a digital divide. They have over 100,000 people they know did not have routine, sustainable access to quality broadband digital services. This is something that we presented back in February, right before the pandemic stopped us all from traveling. But the city really mapped out where that digital divide existed in those particular neighborhoods. They looked at assets that already existed, owned by the city, that they could leverage and bring in private sector investment. And found that there was an opportunity in a market for $500 million worth of private sector investment to go in and install small cell broadband, close the gap on that social inequity, but also create a business opportunity and ideally prioritize for local business. They'd also spent a lot of money on traffic calming projects in 2019, and they saw a lot of value in where to deploy those resources that they'd already trained, based on the pedestrian safety data and some of the incident report data that we pulled into the index. In the COVID context now, I know that they've already allocated a significant amount of money. I think it's $3.5 million worth of COVID money to get about 11,100 students in the highest need territories across the city. Especially when we zero in at the municipal level, what we like to do really always is try to get down to the census tract level, which at Philadelphia for years and vast amount of data available to do that. We want to understand what are the massive issues underlying some of those macro issues around housing. We know that homelessness is a problem. We know that cost burden, both for renters and oftentimes owners, is a problem. We like to measure those two specifically. We want to capture the best available homeless data. Oftentimes that's connecting with multiple continuum of care agencies that are doing point-in-time counts and try to see if there's a way that we can sort of like harmonize the data that we're getting in to make sure that we're getting as representative a count as possible. We also like to look at quality of housing, and that's talking about whether or not there's sufficient plumbing, utility, right? Is it a condemned property? There are a couple different ways we can look at this. There are non-traditional places where you can find actually very excellent sources of data on this, and then there's also proprietary data that can fold in to help us understand whether or not the quality is there. In California, when we mapped out the state down to the county level, and then also are going in now into counties like San Mateo and Orange County, we're really also looking at the availability of housing and the availability of affordable housing. There's a regional housing needs assessment that's done every year by counties, and they filter that up to the state, whether or not they're on track. And we're trying to look at things that aren't just like construction permits being issued, but actual construction stuff. So we're trying to learn a lot from what insight can certain data points actually hide, and really tease out prioritizing the right data that tells us that we're measuring the right concept. We could say that there's 5,000 construction permits started, but only 2 construction starts actually conducted. So it's not about permits; it's whether or not projects and complexes are being built. We also look at other factors that contribute to housing as well, and whether or not they're geospatially, are they in the right place? Are they connected with services? Are there supermarkets there? Are there childcare centers there? Is there a cluster of an economic opportunity, a school, a healthcare access point? Is there a green space there? Is there a quality environment there? Because those also contribute to choices that individuals make on whether or not they want to live in those parts of the city where it's going. And some of the things that we've talked about in San Jose with the Workforce Development Office, we've also supplemented a lot of labor market analysis, look at occupations by census tract, look at skills foundations, and say, look at the assets that people have to connect with certain types of jobs. And so when there's an ongoing debate of which jobs to move in which places that unlink open space for property development, how can we synergize economic development by bringing new jobs into the right places that could capitalize on those skills that exist there and also close the gap on a great housing need? We think that those are opportunities that data can help inform our direction, but not obviously automate them.
Okay, thank you. One last question I have for you. And one of the things we're interested in doing in Philadelphia is being more thoughtful about how we build a future economy. You heard many of my colleagues talk about this crisis as an opportunity, and that future economy is for the city of Philadelphia, and certainly doing so in a way that we could tackle the issues of race and equity. Do you have any thoughts around how this initiative could be used to identify areas of opportunity for our job growth and racial equity?
So, one of the just core elements of what we're really trying to do is measure the gap, right, in between achievement on some critical issues that obviously are integrated into just skills training and education, and health has a massive influence, obviously. We did a little bit of work also in looking at the vulnerability of cities in the U.S. to COVID-19. We saw that the federal information was scattered at best in early days. So we consulted the CDC and looked at risk factors. We actually mapped out vulnerabilities from both an infrastructural standpoint, so where populations are living with or without access to ICU beds or preventative care institutions. We looked at population demographics. We looked at sort of health outcomes, like active smoking rates, COPD, pulmonary disease, cardiac disease, diabetes, obesity rates. We measured this for 500 cities down to the census tract level. When you start to think about just even health vulnerabilities and what COVID has shown us, there is a strategy from a health perspective. There's a strategy from an obviously increasing equity to digital services and greater infrastructure strategy that needs to happen. There's one that needs to happen, I think, in education space as well. Specifically speaking, on race and equity, what we're doing is really we want to identify what are the common trends in those places that are receiving such a vastly smaller share of success? And why is it being distributed in the way it is? How do we picture, the patterns that are repeating themselves across the city and start to tear down some of those issues and invest in those issues that could start to chip away at some of those patterns? On that skills piece and occupational analysis that we did in San Jose, that really was an opportunity for us to sort of disentangle just financial poverty from the equation of saying, by throwing a job into a place where there are poor, financially poor people, you're going to solve that issue. We wanted to look in a much more multidimensional way. We wanted to look at their education rate. We wanted to look at the transportation access and equity. We wanted to look at whether or not there was also a condition where, they could have a vibrant life living within a certain area. A lot of people there choose not to drive 30, 40 miles up to San Francisco or out, somewhere else up and down the peninsula, because it takes them 3 hours to get to and from work. And they may have a mother, elderly mother to take care of. They may have children. So we're really thinking about how we can pinpoint investments in skills, with investments in health, with investments in education, with investments in healthier places and placemaking, and make a more 360-degree view investment into communities, and not just cast one wide net on one particular issue without nuanced information about who we're talking about.
Okay. Listen, we really appreciate your testimony today. I don't know that we have any other questions. I just want to say that one of my best takeaways from your presentation was, I think, one of the mayors who said that they were chasing projects instead of chasing a vision. And I think there's a real lesson to learn from that comment, chasing projects instead of chasing a vision. So thank you today for your testimony, your patience. I know it was a long afternoon. We appreciate you being here. And
Councilmember Down?
Yes, you have a question?
Yeah, just very quickly for Justin. I know you've done work with a number of different cities. Has there been any outreach to organizations like National League of Cities, or I know you mentioned CDCs, but organizations like that could help give some context to the work you're doing to other cities around the country?
Yes. So we've had engagement. Obviously, we met through the Conference of Mayors. We've met with a number of city administrations. I know I met Clarence Anthony through Robert Blaine and Mayor Lumumba in Jackson. I was there in April last year. So we've had a lot of conversations and also a lot of follow-up conversations since COVID hit and some of the mapping that we did around cities. We see them as a very strategic partner. I'm doing a lot more work to scale some of this more rapidly and create a more automated starting point for cities to pick up and then further customize using their own administrative data.
Yeah, just to close, we will be having our national conference in Tampa in the fall. That's going to be a virtual conference, but that could be an opportunity to showcase some of the work you're doing. So I would encourage you to continue that conversation with Clarence.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Green, and that's a great suggestion. And Justin, in a simple question I'm going to ask you, give me a simple answer. What needs to happen for us to bring this here?
We like to know that we're working in earnest with a government partner. When we partner with them, we want to have a little bit of stake in the ground, right? This is a commitment to shifting a lot of things. So we want to be able to ensure that we have access to thought leaders, to people who are decision makers, and that we're collectively sort of brainstorming how do you just move beyond data and move towards implementation, how you can influence decision making on this. There's a financial element to it. We are a nonprofit. We're not a big consultancy that charges, $500,000 for a one-time engagement. The one thing that we don't want to do is build a report and drop it on people and say, this is what your community looks like, and walk away. We want to be there as a sort of thought partner, as a continued leader on how do you measure the right way for management, for program development, but then also encourage other sectors to pick it up. We think this is a very business-friendly opportunity to look at their community from a supply chain perspective and enhance the kind of conversations that are happening across sectors and cities.
Okay, so we're going to, Justin, we'll circle back with you on that. We'd like to see maybe a proposal that we could present, and we'll come back to you on that one. But thank you today for your testimony and your patience and for being here. Really, thank you very much.
Thank you. I learned a lot also.
So now I understand we have some witnesses from the public, and they've been extremely patient. And I ask that they begin their testimony now. And please be sure to state your name for the record before you proceed. Are there any witnesses from the public?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Is this Miss Robinson?
Yes. Am I on up next?
You're up next and you're ready to go.
Yes, I am. Wow, is all I want to say at first. Okay, this is Queen Judith Robinson. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on Resolution 200406. I want to first say that I wish that we could find a better way to include the public in your process. 4 hours, I always try to encourage my fellow citizens to be part of this process. And I always have them on some 4 or 5 hour call or Zoom, and you know, it's hard to encourage them to be good citizens when they have to wait so long to even have input. So I am on the public participation task force of the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, and we're planning for year 2050, okay? So I'm happy to be able to be included in this process. That's where I think a lot is lacking. The average citizen, the people who put you all in position, is not being listened to. I heard the gentleman before me talk about, you know, being a nonprofit and doing a lot of work, and all those statistics I heard, and social impact and social progress. I'm thinking we could do a lot right here in the city of Philadelphia by including black people, not people of color. That gets us all mixed up. I'm talking about black women, like the 70% eviction rate that we have. That's a hell of a statistic right there. That's very telling, okay? We don't have to go too far away to figure out something ain't right. And I'm going to say this. You all, you people who are representing us, you all can start right where you are, including black women. How many of you have them on your staff? How many of you have recommended them for boards and commission? How many of you have included them in all that you do? From top to bottom, we're in the biggest boom in my lifetime. I'm a native of this town, and we're not included, okay? Our children aren't included. Our high school students, when they come out, are not included. Some of them are trained in what we're doing. They're not included. So it's not rocket science. The last time I was in a hearing before the pandemic, you talked about your whole poverty thing. How many times are we going to talk about poverty before we do something about it? Come on, y'all. Let's get to it. Now we're in a pandemic. You find we catching more hell than everybody else. Well, how many times are we going to say this? What you want me to do? How many times you want me to say it? I'm in the heart of North Philly. We catching hell, murder and mayhem. We not be included. The way y'all put these little deals together where you just hook up your friends with this and that. Come on. Stop the nonsense. Let's get it on. Let's really do it. Because we're talking about a $5 billion budget. Okay, you had some money, $900 million, and didn't know what to do with it. Created something called zero waste. I'm so glad that you all got rid of that. Charity starts at home. Remember our parents told us that? Take care of us who live here, who are already here. 2-3 generations, black women running around trying to find housing. And y'all looking at tiny houses. Hey, give me a big house. Give me a house that's sitting over here vacant. Let's not go around the bush with this stuff, because you know what? It's getting worse by the second. So I want to make sure that you focus in on them black women, put them in position. Because, see, when you talk about they being evicted, okay, I'm going to account for a small percentage of deadbeats. Let me keep it real. But you're not going to tell me everybody is a deadbeat with children running around being evicted out of these places just because they don't have no money. I know something about that as a poor black woman from North Philly, okay? Who was able to crawl my way out of that. And it ain't that hard, you know. So I want to focus on poverty. Who we talking about? Talking about black folks all over the place, poverty-stricken, and equity. Racism and white supremacy has always been ongoing. We're talking about those same people. You know why we don't have generational wealth? Because it was stolen from us. We were working for free. We're the same people. So don't get me mixed up talking about some people of color. We do come in many colors. We know that. But we're talking about black people, okay? We're not afraid to be called black as it relates to what we're talking about here. So we're talking about being fiscally responsible, learning financial literacy. You know what? That is excellent to do, because I was like a banker in the 4th grade, so I understand all that. Teaching our children things about being successful and fiscal responsible. But when you've been redlined against, when you had no source of income, you know, or no source of access to capital, okay, then you're going to find yourself calling and crawling and crawling, trying to get the heck out of poverty. So let's talk about, don't get no white man to come and tell y'all with all these 99 statistics. Ask me. I do the RCOs. I can help you out, okay? With a whole bunch of statistics. You running around trying to pay somebody else to talk about me and my health. Please stop. Please stop with the foolishness. Because it's foolishness, you know. It's about lack of inclusion with a $5 billion budget, okay? School budget, this budget, that budget. You're not including black people. That's what the problem is. So get it out, get it right, okay? And you please stop. Can we come out of this pandemic with a whirlwind of real activity? You know, get them encampment people out of North Philly, please. You know, all of that nonsense. We don't have to crawl on the ground to tell you we need a house or come in there with orange shirts on and wait 5 hours to speak. So I'm going to wrap it up, because I know y'all, you know, start cringing when you hear a black woman speak about what the heck is going on. But I want to make sure I really get things in. Get PHA properties online. Stop with the nonsense, okay? You know, this PICA board, I wonder if they have any black women on that board. That's what I want to know. I'm going to be watching them. I want to know, do they have a public process where I can keep an eye on all this going back and forth? Seem like they're doing a pretty good job. I got to meet Mr. Harvey, okay? But I'm going to tell you something. It don't take rocket science, y'all. Consider the black woman the canary in the mine. We catching hell. It's going down, okay? And you want to talk about social progress, we can get it done. This is the most building and banging and carrying on gentrification that I've seen ever. Now, I want to have my councilman answer this question. Of those, there were 1,600 employees that increased to 16,000, is it? That increased to 24,000. Might have my little figures mixed up here. I almost fell asleep while I was writing all these 4 hours. But how many of those people were black? How many of those people were people who lived here? Did you go find some people and immigrate them and migrate them to Philadelphia and then give them a whole department? Or did you hire some black people who are here? Did you disrespect and keep showing racism and white supremacy as these people were hired? You got to be very careful. I think it's an insult that Mayor Kenny, South Philly born and raised, from what I understand, we give him 25 years in city council, or 22, whatever it was, and he come up with every task force for everything. Y'all need to stop. Stop it, because we watching y'all coming with this foolishness. It's absolute foolishness. You know, all right, listen, my time is up, right? Okay, have a good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the testimony, and I just want to clarify something so that we're clear. The extra 1,600 in that number they're not being hired. So that's not going to happen. That was just a projection, but they are not filling those positions. I just want to clarify that for your benefit.
Yeah. Well, if they do fill them, make sure we get some black faces in them, okay? So we stop being so poverty-stricken. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Robinson.
Yeah, have a good day.
You too. Thank you. Have a good evening. I'd like to recognize my colleague, Councilmember Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I understand Mrs. Robinson's concern. I understand that Philadelphians across the city are struggling, especially Black Philadelphians. I think we heard that on our call earlier today. And I know this is a difficult situation for the average Philadelphian to sit through this entire process, and it's not easy on our end as well, too, and we're trying our best. And so we're open to any recommendations that folks have. We also have what's called the Disadvantaged Communities Task Force that I just wanted to communicate that will be doing hearings all across the city of Philadelphia to hopefully address the issue that Ms. Robinson communicated, as it relates to us as members of council and as members of local government, listening to narratives and giving Philadelphians an opportunity to do what she just did and communicate her frustration and hopefully dive into even more detail as it relates to things that we can do specifically as legislators to allocate resources, as well as to advocate for things to address the issues that she's talking about right now. So I thank her for her testimony. I appreciate her passion and her concern. I know that this is going to be a long journey for us as we figure out what do we do to fight for resources for communities post-coronavirus, but I also want to communicate my appreciation for her advocacy for Black women. I have a Black woman on my staff. I know a lot of other council members have multiple Black women on their staff, and Black women continue to lead, and we want to continue to advocate for them as well too. So I just want to let her know that we appreciate it, and hopefully she'll get an opportunity to testify when we do the different town halls across the city, so we can get even more in-depth information for her. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilmember Thomas, and thank you for your remarks. Appreciate it. Are there any other people here to testify from the public? All right, seeing none, I want to thank everybody for being here today and their patience in this long hearing. And I think having more regular and transparent conversations about the city's finances, goals, and outcomes is very important part of the work we do on behalf of the people we serve. So I look forward to seeing you all back here soon. And this concludes the hearing on Resolution 200-406. The hearing is adjourned. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Great job.